And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's great to have everyone here. It's already an amazing crowd, and I can see you're already asking some good questions. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And we have a very special show for you this evening, which is all about Tesla and Trump and their connections to the X technology and how those family connections of Trump's, notably his uncle, John Trump, from MIT, really played a large role in the development of that X tech and into the situation we find ourselves in today with Trump calling for the creation of a space force. This is an unprecedented scenario that we're in, and we've been building toward it, I would say, since 1947 at least. Now, one of the things that we do on the show, if you're not familiar with it, is we've been going in the X series here into the X Steganography. And the X is something that I discovered when I was looking at different programs that were going black, and they would resurface with a new name. Or just before they went black, they would kind of go out of, they'd sort of make records, and, we'd be looking at these situations of these aeronautics going off the charts. And then suddenly these programs would disappear, and this remnant would come up, a la Blue Gemini X20 Dinosaur. This kind of switch out would occur, and then X20 Dinosaur would disappear, and then the X15 would be on the horizon. So we had these very unusual situations going on. And one of the things I started to track was the frequency with which the switch out would happen, how many years it would take, etc. So in all of the X planes, these decided at some point on a government level in America that they would come out and basically release their secret about the development of these X planes over 5 decades. And the X planes, in my opinion, were the core hybrid of this UFO file technology and our own kind of innovation. And what was happening, though, was when I would look at it just from the sweep of the UFO file, it didn't quite make sense. There were problems with it, basically, because when we were looking at it, the UFO file didn't seem to account for it all, because if you went further back in time before the waves of sightings, you would find all of this mystery school activity referring to the same type of technology. And so this idea just of attributing it to some off-world civilization wasn't going to cut it. There was something much deeper going on. And then the more I got into it, the more I realized that the X was a signifier in all of these programs to track the effects of a particular type of technology and the unusual things that would happen in relation to it, what I call reality distortion. So we were looking at a situation where we weren't just tracking redeveloped UFO parts. We were just actually tracking an effect, a reality distortion field that seemed to occur through centuries. And by the time it gets to the UFO file and the large-scale secrecy that's built up in the deep state around this whole subject of UFOs, it seemed to be kind of at a fever point where they just had to erect this wall and really dumb down the entire culture around the matter until they were prepared at such point to roll it out on their terms and to their benefit, which is a disaster in the making. And we're going to get into that a little bit tonight. But the figure of John Trump being President Trump's uncle is quite fascinating in this whole setup, because John Trump was a professor at MIT. He was a mechanical engineer, and he had many laudable accomplishments that I'll go into tonight. But what we need to know about him is that he was the protege of, and Vannevar Bush, who was his mentor. And Vannevar Bush, for anyone who's studied the UFO file, is the custodian of the UFO file. He is the man on the scientific side who's in charge of that entire activity. And that's been substantiated now through the work of Bill Steinman. And Bill Steinman was a very kind of really detailed, precision-oriented researcher on the UFO side. And we need more of those. But he came along and he wrote a book called The Aztec Crash, which was just amazing. And he goes in there, and in that point during the 1980s, he talks to Tsar Barker. And this book has really been kind of shoved aside in the grand. It's not really known as one of the great classics of the UFO field, and yet it's the best research, really, when you get right down to it. And what Steinman found out in his conversation with Sarbarker, who was one of the top physicists up there with Oppenheimer and that ilk during the 50s and 60s, was that, yeah, you know, Vannevar Bush was in charge of the UFO program. Absolutely. Sarbarker confirmed it, and he said what it was about. And he said basically that they used him on this intermittent level. And he was like, I don't know why there's this level of secrecy around it. Why didn't they ever let it out? Well, a little while later, maybe about 18 months later, Sarbarker ended up dead. And it's quite fascinating because little by little, they were able to lift him out of the history books. Of course, there's still scant mention of him here and there. But one of the fascinating things I like to show in relation to Sarbarker is even his Wikipedia page does not exist. And Wikipedia, you know, he's become a non-person in the Orwellian sense, according to Wikipedia. So we have to wonder why, you know, why would they erase this guy from history? What's the real truth around Trump and his uncle, and what's going on there in relation to the secrecy of the UFO file? But what's interesting is the secrecy existed around the Tesla work and Nikola Tesla's work. He was an engineer, of course, who came over here from Serbia in the late 19th century and wanted to work for Thomas Edison. He was one of these just incredible geniuses, and we owe most of our accomplishments of the last 150 years to Nikola Tesla's work, including alternating current, which is what electrifies the world and connects the world, along with wireless transmission. These are all things that are in his lexicon and that he really put together. And he was a largely suppressed figure in a few ways. He even, of course, came up with the first viable radio inventions. And years later in the US Supreme Court, it was solved that no, it was not Marconi, it was Tesla who had put these things together. And again, we see, like with Edison, the pushing aside of this very important figure. So we're going to weigh out these factors tonight in light of the X technology, which is Nikola Tesla's work. Before him, John Keeley, of course, a large-scale connection to the mystery schools and secret societies of the 19th century there. And then the political ascendancy of Donald Trump, which I think is unprecedented, really. And the push-pull between Trump and the Clintons and the Democrats for control of this UFO file and control of the rollout of the UFO file. So we're going to have a lot of fun with that tonight. And one of the things that I think we really are going to go into is, you know, we kind of did a prelude to this episode when we did one on the time capsule relating to President Nixon's time capsule and President Trump and Tesla, which is an episode we did back in March. And at that point, actually, I had some of the outlines of what I wanted to say in relation to this. But in 3 months, a number of things have come to light in my research surrounding it, and I could do a much more complete job of presenting it. There was, just for lack of time, some things that didn't make it into that episode. So this one is really the full spectrum, and it's going to give us the real wide-angle lens on this, which is something we need very much. Of course, when we're talking tonight about questions and all, and I see some people are already doing it, when you ask questions, the best way, Olivia, who's moderating the chat, as well as putting all the questions together for us in the second part of the program, that's going to be very important to just ask them all in caps, because they're going to be easy to pick out, and then she can list them. And there's no one who can track that stuff better. So put it up there once, and you don't have to really worry about it. And I think what's important too is that, you know, this idea of keeping the questions on the topic of Trump and the Space Force and the UFO file and Tesla and the whole X technology, I really want those questions to come right down the middle on the X show tonight. So we'll get into other things on another show, you know, some of the political stuff that's going on. I know a lot of people want to talk about Peter Strzok, and I don't blame you after his very amusing testimony today. I think the line of the day was about medication there. Olivia, what do you think?
It was fascinating.
It was pretty good. And Strzok is a lot to answer for, and, you know, being kind of the way that he was in that hearing, I don't think helped his position any. But it is fascinating because, of course, this push to get rid of Trump comes out of the FBI, comes out of the CIA. And just for the record, anyone can have their own political opinion one way or another. But certainly the fact that Trump is duly elected means the CIA and the intelligence agencies and the FBI shouldn't be allowed to change the outcome because he wasn't the deep state player they were looking for. They were looking for a different team. So, it's very interesting when you get into that. So there's a lot of politics swirling around, but we are going to keep our focus on the X because what we found with the X is that we have something here that's very much like the Rosetta Stone. And I think that's really the good comparison because with the Rosetta Stone, for years and years, these Egyptologists were looking at these hieroglyphs and they did not have the key. They didn't have that thing that they needed in order to thrive, in a sense. And so we're looking at a situation really where when they found the Rosetta Stone, the hieroglyphs came to life for them. Suddenly they weren't just a bunch of ridiculous, bizarre, fascinating, intriguing pictures that didn't mean anything. It was a language. And by the way, I still don't think we know what all the hieroglyphs mean, but nonetheless, we had that key there because the Rosetta Stone was written in those three languages, the Coptic and the Greek and the hieroglyphs. And so that way, those people at that time knew how to coordinate them. So that when they had that message there, it was all three languages. We could finally pick up, aha, this means that. Well, the X Steganography is exactly like that. And interestingly enough, we do have a Twitter follower out there who is Resonate Zero, who pointed out something out to me, which is that Rachel Maddow, of all people, on MSNBC, went into a whole thing about steganography and how these Russians were using steganography in order to invade our country or whatever it happens to be. And so she says, to further the aims of the conspiracy, Moscow Center arranged for the defendants clandestinely to communicate with the Russian Federation in particular. The conspirators have used, among others, the secret communication methods described below, steganography and radiograms. Well, steganography, you get your time in the spotlight here. We've been talking about it on the X show since the beginning of the year. And now Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. Well, there you go. But they're catching on. And I think it's interesting, too, because I turned to Olivia at that point. I think I said something like, I think the last person to use the term before me was John D., maybe. Steganography is just one of those things that you don't hear much about. But it's interesting because it's different than cryptology, where, in cryptology, there's a puzzle there and you know that you need to solve it. And it's very much like the Enigma machines that the Germans used. There was always someone trying to crack the code. Well, steganography is actually very different. Steganography is something that's there. It might be the clock in the town center. It might be the mural there. It's something that's in plain sight that someone doesn't know is a code, but is speaking to someone who knows. And that's what I've discovered in working with around the X, which is that this is exactly the process that we're observing with it. And it is fascinating because every time I get deeper into the research, more of it comes forward. And you have to have a tremendous filter, but I've developed quite an eye for spotting which X's and which X steganography fit into the thing that we're talking about. That is the hiding of this technology through time, through the mystery schools, through these stealth archives, as I call them. And let's talk about stealth archives for a minute because we have to get oriented for the conversation that's going to follow. Stealth archives would be like the letter X. And the X envelope, for example, in the LBJ library, which I show this pretty much in every show, this letter is not to be opened until 2023. It's called the X letter at the LBJ library, and it's something that LBJ left behind as a signal, basically, which is, this is something that I can't reveal in prime time while I'm alive, but 50 years after the fact, I want to be on the record. And that is the nature of what we're talking about with the X letters. It's very important to keep that in mind. And the idea is that these things refer to this X technology, and they all want to report their role in it. My take on all the X letters is that they all have something to do with the UFO file, and that is predominantly what it is that we're referring to when we're going into the X technology. The larger story about UFOs and off-world civilizations and advanced technology you don't even need to answer the entire question around that just to get to the X part. You can actually solve a number of puzzles, whether your position is off-world cultures are visiting here, or we have an advanced civilization here on the Earth, or the Nazis left behind advanced tech. It all plays together. And as you'll see, there's a lot of Nazis who play into the X programs, especially Walter Dornberger, who I want to point out is really the key to the X program, who we bring over in the paperclip program. There's another shot at the X letter. So these things exist. I mean, you know, it's not something I'm guessing at. They're just there. They're stealth archives. We can't get our hands on them. We had a tremendous insider come forward last February, who Robert Merritt was someone who had worked for Nixon off and on for a number of years in the Houston plant, and he came forward and talked about this X time capsule. This time capsule had all this information relating to advanced technology. And that was something which closed a loop for me, because I had so much around Nixon and this Trump relationship that was starting to bother me, that it was not out there and being picked up in the public. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. We're really going to get to the core of that and who the intermediary between Trump and Nixon was. That gives us a whole lot of setup, because Nixon knew the presidency quite well, and that's why we see Trump, when he gets in there, you know, kind of rolls with the job, and he's got the know-how. This, I think, is very important. One of the things I always like to point out is that our logo for Dark Journalist is an X, but I chose that before I was doing the X research. So that's just a very straight ahead logo. And I was thinking of cross patterns, you know, things coming in from different angles. And it's quite fascinating when you think about it, because here we are so deep now in episode 18 of the X series. And this is going to be such a crucial episode, I think. And I highly recommend, you know, for someone who's just coming in and discovering this, really watch this episode and then start right back at the beginning, because you're going to get a full picture by going through those episodes and picking up on the things that you enjoy. Now, every time we do a show, at the second half of the show, we ask questions and we do a big Q&A. And I have to tell you that that kind of crowdsourced interaction and crowdsourced intelligence that we have going on is really a phenomenon. And that's really because of you guys. I think there's so many smart and gifted people out there with great experience and great knowledge and great backgrounds. And they're sharing so much with us here on the Dark Journalist show that it's really fantastic. So what I want to recommend for everyone who's in the chat is to make sure that you're signed up for our free newsletter. Now, there were a few things going on where, like, there was a firewall on getting the newsletter for about a week there. Just go back and sign up for the newsletter. There's a confirmation process in place. We have a good, fantastic mail server up there. And you'll get a free newsletter in your inbox every week telling you what shows are coming up, what issues we're covering, what X series is coming up, and some of the exciting things that we have booked for August, which are just off the charts. Go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. You'll get a confirmation email now. Just hit that confirmation email and you're all set. You're in the system. And it's one of those things where I think we need that kind of communication one-on-one, because you know how the social media platforms are. Here today, gone tomorrow. And, you know, that's fine. That's what they want to do. And we've done quite well with them. So I don't know if we're going to have a problem, but I will say that it's quite important to make sure that we have that private channel of communication. It's more important, I would say. So, you know, that's something I think would be really beneficial. Now, going further into the X's, I saw in my research that President Eisenhower had an X time capsule, and he called it Project X. He said it in 1953, and there was all this information in there about Nixon, which I found unusual. What's so great about Nixon that you're going to put in a time capsule? Well, I guess in 2053, we're going to find out. So we've got Project X from Eisenhower. We've got Lyndon Johnson's X letter. We've got Nixon with his time capsule pertaining to X. And we have the whole kerfuffle that took place between President Kennedy, the CIA, and the NASA paperclip Nazis, basically, who came into that program and tried to boss him around. And that's where the whole Blue Gemini aspect comes up. So when I bring in Blue Gemini, it's at the very heart of the intersection between what Tesla brought out on one hand and what Trump is trying to do with the Space Force on the other. The nexus of those two things is going to fit right in. So literally, we're going to get into all of those subjects in one episode, and we're going to pull it off in a timely fashion. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the X's are something that's there hidden in plain sight, and just like the stealth archives. Now, another thing I want to point out, which is that when I talk about the UFO file, it's a little bit different than how people refer to these things. We've had great researchers tackling the UFO issue for many years. This isn't really about that. I've tracked an effect that I call apotheum. An apotheum is a reality distortion field that seems to play with the fabric of time. It seems to play with electricity. It seems to upset the physics of a given area or situation where it shows up. So apotheum is something that can be tracked through the mystery schools and picked up in themes by groups like Theosophy, for example, and the work of Helena Blavatsky, and the work of Anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner. And I've featured them prominently, so I'm not going to go too deep into the mystery school stuff tonight because I think people are getting a pretty good understanding of what I'm talking about there. But the idea simply is this, that this effect, when it comes into our reality, changes things dramatically. And at a certain point had to be hidden. That is before our modern technological age. They didn't want this thing coming out and sort of people getting a hold of it and a small group, controlling a smaller group, a small group controlling a larger group, excuse me. So when we look at the situation now and we're seeing what's going on now, we can see that some of the things that these mystery schools were afraid of are actually starting to happen. Where a very small group on top with a lot of power is controlling, creating this kind of global control grid. And now they're going to control it from space, and then they're going to control the local solar system and beyond. Using this kind of technology under the guise of creating this kind of space-friendly atmosphere for space tourism and all this other stuff. Well, unfortunately, it has more sinister backgrounds there. And so, although I'd like to say that with President Kennedy's goal of getting us into space and kind of getting us to the moon and all the things that he was looking forward to, that once we got to the moon and then stopped going post-1972, that something went wrong in these programs, that they went black and they started to be listed and the people inside could track them by using the X. The X was a steganography that they had developed early on, and people like J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI were using it. So I'm going to give demonstrations of all these things tonight. So let's keep in mind that the X is, it's this kind of title that's been given over centuries to a particular type of effect that happens. And that the X technology, when we get into the 20th century, into the 21st century, now we're dealing with it as X tech, whatever it was. And that X tech seems to be coming directly out of the UFO file. And that's where the clashes have come out, that we've had presidents like Kennedy and people who wanted to open up, have kind of what a Gorbachev glasnost around this whole UFO issue. And there were these groups inside the government national security state that wanted to block that. Now, we have to be kind of very cautious not to simplify it and say you got some bad people and some good people. There's a whole range of interests in the middle. And as we're going to find out, interesting groups are vying at this. But one of the things that I always say in relation to the deep state, and when I refer to the deep state, I'm referring to it in the terms of Professor Peter Dale Scott, who talked about the deep state in a very specific way, that it's this kind of parallel system that is operating and sometimes comes over through deep events into the public system, does something to change a public policy, and then moves back underground. That's very different than the way that it's used and thrown about in the popular corporate media or even in alternative media. So I always refer to the work of Berkeley professor Peter Dale Scott. But in my opinion, what's really true is that the deep state is a symptom of the war between the mystery schools. We have to keep that in mind because the mystery schools have been steps and leaps and bounds ahead of the average kind of reality, the average knowledge base. And they've been there kind of moving and shaping humanity's direction over time. How does that all get us to Trump? Well, let's talk a little bit about John Trump. John Trump, who, as I pointed out, let's take a look at him, actually. He's a great guy. He actually he grew up maybe like 20 minutes from here. And he was a professor at MIT. He was deep in their programs, and he had a number of interesting patents. One of them was with Robert Van de Graaff, who really is one of the most important scientists around X-rays. And this is what John Trump was so good at. But we think of X-rays just in terms of its medical capability. And certainly they used it for that. But they used it in terms of particle acceleration. They used it in terms of space. There's so many different applications for X-ray. But one thing that popped out at me, I should say that when I went to MIT, Olivia and I took a little field trip over there. It's about 10 minutes from here. And to look at John Trump's papers. And John Trump papers are kept in box X. And I'm going to show you that here. There's definitely, the steganography is very active here on that. But that is X. That's the box X there that his papers are kept in. Now, what you expect to find there in his papers, you will find. There might be some bombshells in there, but I haven't seen any so far. But I think what was in there and the kind of lineage of what was going on through Trump, Professor John Trump, the X is designated there for a purpose so people who are inside these programs can look at it and say, there's this box X. That's good enough for us. One of the key things that's in here is that there are these patents and correspondence from John Trump and Vannevar Bush. And they list two. So de Graaff, Vannevar Bush, and Trump. Now, it was Trump's mentor, Vannevar Bush, who puts him together with Van de Graaff, who's this X-ray expert, and they do groundbreaking work for decades. But these patents are also interesting because they relate to advanced energy. And we can see as we get along, by the time we get to 1942, and Vannevar Bush is in charge of all these scientific programs for the government, including the Office of Scientific Research and Development for Roosevelt, that what's actually taking place is that when Tesla dies, the FBI goes directly to the scientific office and asks Bush, who do we need on this? Who can we go through Tesla's papers with? And Bush sends Trump. Now, this is kind of fascinating because we have to remember now, as I stated earlier, that Vannevar Bush, from his position, and he'll be the director of the Carnegie Foundation, as well as the liaison for 4 different presidents for the UFO File. And according to Robert Sarbarker, who's the top physicist in the country, he's going to be the one who will basically find out everything scientifically and put together the right people to study the crashed retrievals of UFOs. It's a pretty amazing, hardcore job if you think about it. And the level of trust is huge. But one of the things that he had on his side, Vannevar Bush, is that Vannevar Bush was a master mason. And he is somebody who was in charge of the MIT Lodge. Masons. Excuse me. Boy, it is hot in here, Olivia, I'm telling you. Mm-hmm. That's why the water is so good. And I always see Olivia with this kind of gallon of water over there, and I'm always wondering, what's the problem? It's cool, but not today. Vannevar Bush, on the cover of Time magazine, he'd really cemented his entire, reputation by then. And he was thought of as the man who really helped America win World War II. And he ran something called the RADLAB. And the RADLAB had Professor John Trump, it had Vannevar Bush, and it had our friends, the Varian brothers. The Varian brothers are also a major factor in all this because the Varian brothers would create the klystron, which became the foundation for microwave radar, which helped us win World War II. But they also created the first particle accelerators. That's where we get CERN. That's where we get that whole development of particle acceleration. So where did the Varian brothers come from? Well, they came out of Halcyon, which was the theosophical kind of ultra utopia. And that one was in California. And their dad was John Varian, who was the top, and I mean the top, theosophist in Ireland, who came over here on the instructions of Annie Besant, who was in charge of the Theosophical Society. Okay. So a quick shot here on Vannevar Bush. Here is Bush at the Grand Lodge. He is a worshipful master. He's listed there. And we're going to find Masons everywhere we turn in this story. And that's not to say that Masons are bad, but you're going to find these groups who are good with secrecy for one reason or another are right in the heart of the UFO file and the Tesla-Trump story. Okay, a quick thing. Electrical engineer Vannevar Bush is best remembered for his 45 landmark essay, As We May Think. Now, that essay is credited with starting the modern computer age. And between Vannevar Bush and John Neumann, who are both closely associated with the UFO file, we get the explosion of Silicon Valley and all the technology that followed with Xerox, Microsoft, and Apple, and all the rest of it. So this is really at the very heart of it, and these people have access to the most advanced information on the UFO file. So we're getting some idea of maybe where this X-Tech is mixing in, kind of. We're getting the X-Tech vibe. He was also the president from 39 to 55 of the Carnegie Institution and chairman from 46 to 47 of the Joint Research and Development Board. He also, is someone who launched the careers of people like John Trump, but Richard Thurman and other people who became quite important to Silicon Valley. So he's a real mover and a shaker. Okay, so a quote now from Vannevar Bush, from Dr. John Trump, from when he's called in to review Tesla's papers. And the FBI gets a hold of Vannevar Bush. Bush points them to John Trump, and John Trump is now with them, going over to this strange hotel, basically breaking in to Trump's hotel room and to Tesla's hotel room to get all this information. Okay, what he said was, quote, and this is Dr. John Trump speaking, "I was particularly looking for something which would be evidence of a secret weapon, which I was reminded by the two FBI agents who were present during the entire time was a matter of concern to the United States. It had the capability of acting at a great distance, of being destructive to, quote, flying objects." Well, this is interesting, because 2 years later, we would get from the FBI the designation unidentified flying object. So here is Trump saying their concern with what Tesla's machine wasn't about this death ray thing. It was something else. The death ray is kind of the cover story. What he said was, it was a matter of concern to the United States. It had the capability of acting at a great distance, of being destructive to, quote, flying objects. At a place that was remote from the source. So in other words, there I am in Hawaii, and I've got my drone button, and we see a UFO flying over the city of London, and I press a button, and it goes down. This was the nature of the thing that Tesla was working on, that they were worried about. Now, it's very complex, as is the FBI's relationship to the UFO file, which we're going to get into. Let's meet a few people. Okay. That is Vannevar Bush with Harry Truman. That's the president of Harvard with them. And all these people are going to play in very strongly. Vannevar Bush would become the head of MJ-12 for President Truman. This is Vannevar Bush at MIT at the RADLAB, where he had people like the Varian brothers, and where he had our friend John Trump, who was his protege, in here. And the RADLAB became the most secret and the most elite organization scientifically to win the war during World War II. The question is, they weren't just working on the Manhattan Project. As a matter of fact, the Manhattan Project was largely farmed out to other groups. So the RADLAB was working on something else. There are the Varian brothers. And as I said, they played a major role in bringing us on board to win World War II by their intense research. Now, they come out of a sect, Theosophy, at the Halcyon Temple in California. And that temple, if we kind of take the mystery schools now into account, that temple is under the watchful eye of Master Hilarion. And Master Hilarion is this kind of figure that is, associated in theosophical dogma with science. He basically brings the science ray. So it's quite an interesting thing that these guys are playing on that territory. By the way, since we're on the subject of Theosophy, of course, Henry Wallace was part of the same temple, Halcyon of Theosophy, and he was FDR's vice president. And he plays in very strongly. I call him President X because he was supposed to be president instead of Harry Truman, but Harry Truman instead got in as vice president just a couple months before FDR died. So Henry Wallace was going to be the Theosophical President X. But it didn't happen because the plot was foiled. Mostly it was foiled on a Masonic line. And we'll see that those battles go on all the time. We're just not very aware of it. Okay, there's another picture of Wallace and FDR, and he's getting FDR to sign this Roerich Pact, and Roerich is, of course, a theosophist who is also like a spiritual leader and a political guy, and he's all over the joint. But what he's doing is he's saying to these different countries, hey, when you bomb, when we're at war, you will leave these cultural artifacts and the museums and things like that alone. Quite interesting. So the Varian brothers, who really bring so much of this advanced technology into the X program and develop the Klystron and develop CERN and all the rest of it, their dad is John Varian, and they come out of Halcyon. That's a very important point as we move along into Trump and his relationships with Tesla as we get along. Quick shot there of Halcyon Temple, and that's John Varian, the dad of the Varians there. So keep him in mind as we come along. I think anyone who watches the X series know how the value I place on the Varians. Okay, now that we've set up those players, let's talk about one of the main players, which is Nikola Tesla. Tesla's fascinating for a number of reasons. That is, even without the X technology, the kind of altered states he goes into to get his information are fascinating, and his general kind of almost alien mystique, I think, is like nothing else. And the fact that he's responsible for, so many of our modern innovations is one thing, and we really have to, have so much to thank him for, if you think about it. And that Edison took so much of the credit for so many of those things and really used him in a number of ways. Strange, because Edison was his hero and he came over here to help him, but there's no question that Edison screwed him. And he lived a very repressed life. But one of the things he was trying to do, and I would say really the crux of what got him blackballed by the establishment, including the J.P. Morgans and the Thomas Edisons of the world, is that in his research, he discovered that the same way he had created these radio waves to go across continents, he also developed the idea that we could transmit broadband across the spectrum energy the same way. So it would be wirelessly free energy the same way we broadcast radio waves. This was a really big problem. And originally, what happened was Morgan wanted to get on board. And a lot of these money powers, including the Astors in New York, who are going to play very strong into this, they're going to play a major role in John Keely's development and all the technology he's doing. And he's running parallel with Tesla, but he dies suddenly in 1899. And his work was really like almost, let's use our psychic energy to fly these planes. And he had these demonstrations for the military where, according to the military person who wrote down the record when he was there, this isn't in the 1890s, that he was flying these airships at 500 miles an hour. So we can see that there's something bubbling up here under the surface. And with Tesla's work, now we have in the Wardenclyffe Tower something that would broadcast free energy. Now, the thing about J.P. Morgan and his financing of this project was he was looking to get a leg up on all these other people. He thought he had missed out on a few things. He was an incredible monopolizer, an incredible businessman. There's a lot of weird things about Morgan that I've looked into that we can't spend too much time on Morgan, but I'll tell you two odd things. One is that he's got a lot of mesmerists in his family, you know, people who are dealing with hypnotism and things like that. And mesmerism was a craze from more like the 17th century, and it involved this magnetic healing and mesmerization. So he has that. The second thing is he has an extreme dislike of being photographed, which I also found interesting. And there's a famous picture of him beating someone up with a cane for taking his photograph. But I couldn't help but mention that little side note on J.P. Morgan. But J.P. Morgan does get involved with, and he does at first finance Tesla for this tower. A little background information on the tower. Here we go. By the way, I should announce here that before the show is over, you're going to know for a fact that not only was Tesla's work stolen by a group that isn't identified in government records, but that also it relates directly to the UFO file, and that is what the military concludes when they do their search for it. So I'll give you a little highlight for things that are to come. Okay. How are we doing over there, Miss Olivia?
Doing great.
Great. Getting a lot of questions already?
Yes, and they're all over the place.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we really have a great crew out there, and it's exciting minds. Try to keep the questions, for anyone who's watching, try to keep the questions focused around Tesla, the UFO file, Trump, John Trump, the X Steganography work that we're doing, the Varian brothers. Keep it there. There's a lot of good answers and a lot of good things that can come out of that. Whereas we can't really go into deeper things like chemtrails or other issues tonight. We're really going to stay super focused. But I do love talking about chemtrails, of course, and we are going to have a show coming up in August dealing with that. Okay. A little bit about the Wardenclyffe Tower. Give us an idea of what was under development here. Okay, so Wardenclyffe, which I just showed, take another look at this. Quite a fascinating building. And this was going to be originally for these, you know, transatlantic radio broadcasts. And then Tesla figures out, oh, when I come back to J.P. Morgan, I'm going to show you how to do this. You'll be the man who transmits free energy everywhere. Well, at first he likes the idea, and then he realizes the implications. Then he's like, aha, we have to shut Tesla off completely, and that's what they do. They pull the plug. But before they do, let's just get the official description on Wardenclyffe. Okay. Wardenclyffe, also known as Tesla Tower, was an early experimental wireless transmission station designed and built by Nikola Tesla in Shoreham, New York. That's Long Island. In 1901 to 1902, Tesla intended to transmit messages, telephony, and even fax images across the Atlantic to England. So we have Tesla now moving into fax. Fax machines didn't become a big deal till the 1980s. Let's think about that for a minute. I mean, this guy has wireless transmission. He's got cell phones, basically. He's got remote control. He demonstrated that. And here he is ready to send pictures across the Atlantic. Okay. And he was going to send it to England and to ships at sea based on his theories of using the Earth to conduct the signals. His decision to scale up the facility and add his ideas of wireless power transmission to better. Well, they go into this thing about Marconi. But interestingly enough, as we know, the 1943 Supreme Court case threw out that Marconi was the radio inventor. It was actually our friend Nikola Tesla. Okay. The project's primary backer was financier J.P. Morgan. Additional investment could not be found once he shut it down. The project was abandoned in 1906, never to become operational. So there is the change there, 1906. And 1906, they had the ability, had they put the time and money into it, to have the whole world with the wireless energy. And that's something that could have given America a great edge and all the rest of it. But it would have completely taken out different interests, like the Rockefellers, who were so deep on the oil economy that was really just coming into fruition. And, Henry Ford and all that stuff was all based on this fossil fuel paradigm, which was already dinosaur. And they were looking at Tesla and they were saying, you know what? We thought this guy was going to make us some money for our own innovation. But now we look at him and we see an enemy, because he's going to wipe out all of our profits and he's going to minimize everything by basically creating this gigantic equality across the board where people won't have to crawl to us for energy anymore. Forget about it. We're going to get them hooked on rotary phones and wire electricity for centuries, basically. And so they put us back in the dark ages because they had something better here. But in the meantime, they certainly used the innovations that he was working on and they developed them. So we'll get into that. Okay. In an attempt to satisfy Tesla's debts, they say here, the tower was demolished. As a matter of fact, the tower was demolished by the J.P. Morgan Company for scrap in 1917, and the property taken in foreclosure in 1922. So they're saying the J.P. Morgan Company, Tesla owed him money. That's why they destroyed it. Now, they just wanted that thing off the face of the earth after they figured out how it worked. They didn't want anything left about that. Now, a couple of things about what Tesla thought it was going to be able to do. And just a quick shot of Tesla. This is Tesla in his prime. Really, the person out of time, the kind of inventor who fell to earth, who gave us so much, but was really largely repressed. And so repressed, in fact, that he wasn't discovered until his 100th birthday. Some scientists went back and were like, oh yeah, he's the one who gave us so much. And that was in the late 50s. And recently, Tesla just had a birthday a couple of days ago because he's July 10th birthday. Tesla's design for Wardenclyffe grew out of his experiments beginning in the early 1890s. Okay, so he discarded a lot of the things that were going on at the time, which were really kind of clunky experiments with radio and all the rest. He developed his own ideas on how a worldwide wireless system would work. He theorized from these experiments that if he injected electric current into the Earth at just the right frequency, he could harness what he believed was the planet's own electrical charge and cause it to resonate at a frequency that would be amplified in standing waves that could be tapped anywhere from the planet. There's your wireless energy. It's already there in the Earth itself. The Earth has an electrical system covering it, electromagnetic waves. Now, this is his own quote in an article titled Talking with Planets in 1901. He described a system of energy transmission and of telegraphy without use of wires as this, quote, using the Earth itself as the medium for conducting the currents, thus dispensing with wires and all other artificial conductors. A machine which, to explain its operation in plain language, resembled a pump in action, drawing electricity from the Earth and driving it back into the same at an enormous rate, thus creating ripples or disturbances which, spreading through the Earth as through a wire, would be detected at great distances by carefully attuned receiving circuits. In this manner, he was able to transmit at a distance. Free energy, there it is. Now, they had problems because they're on this oil paradigm, like I'm talking about. And so that people go back years later and they look at Tesla's work, and they're halfway decent scientists of one stripe or another, and they say, why didn't we just use that? And they get up to a certain point, they start using it, and they're like, hey, we can have this free energy device. And strangely enough, very often they wind up in some bizarre plane crash or, suddenly their house goes on fire. So there's such an intense suppression of this alternative energy and the sources of it that we get into a lot of deep problems when we get into Tesla. And Tesla saw this too. He lived it. As a matter of fact, when J.P. Morgan shut off his funding for Wardenclyffe, he went back to him and said, you have to do this for humanity's sake. Plus, it'll be great for you. Your name will go down in history and all the rest of it, appealing to his ego. But not understanding the level of treachery inside that business world, he wrote J.P. Morgan 50 letters. And J.P. Morgan he knew the handwriting was on the wall. If that oil paradigm was going to stay in place, gasoline was going to be the thing. If the combustion engine was going to be the big deal, well, they were going to have to keep all this advanced stuff underground, and they were going to be able to harness it because they owned patents on what he was doing. So it's pretty bad. So interestingly enough, there's a weird period here where Tesla goes away to Colorado Springs, and the work that he's doing is so advanced that people would for years be trying to figure out exactly what was taking place. And those, we see all those things in his studio. There are all these images of him sitting there with all this lightning going on. And so much of that research was about lightning. And in fact, his research around how to harness ball lightning would become something that a number of different scientists would pick up on. And what happened, funny enough, is that when he was in Colorado, you have these situations in these news reports of the people who are driving the horses going on, and their horseshoes are now sparking because he's using so much electricity and sending it back into the earth. And they're getting all these complaints about it. And he is working nonstop because he's known to work without any sleep. And this is something that happened to him when he was in school, which is the professors were writing his dad letters saying, look, you have to get this guy to sleep because he's up 3 hours, 3 days at a time, and he gets 3 hours sleep, and then it's another 3 days at a time. What's going on with this guy? And, he just had this kind of electric mind, as it were. There's a picture of him working at Colorado Springs, and you can see that he's basically deep into it there. He looks maybe like somebody who's just in a completely altered state. But he's accomplishing great things. The work in Colorado Springs would become the subject of a lot of different searches, but oddly enough, a lot of that work is still not understood even today. Now, alternating current is certainly quite well understood, and if we think about Tesla, we should think about alternating current, because remember that Edison had direct current, which is you need a generator, you've got the direct current, boom. Alternating current, more or less, it creates the type of situation where you don't need to have these generators all over the place. And it was a much more advanced topic. And Edison was threatened by this, and there was this whole clash about it. And Edison had a lifelong rivalry, including when Tesla came over, basically using his ideas and then making him dig ditches and things like that, and promising him bonuses that would never show up, and giving him projects and saying, if you finish the project, I'll give you $50,000. And Tesla mastering the project, and then him saying, well, I have a good sense of humor. You have to get on board with American sense of humor. I don't think it's really lying or stretching it to say that Edison was really like the crass, kind of ugly corporatist, if you think about it. Whatever else he brought to the table, he showed an immense amount of enmity and jealousy for Tesla. But the problem was, when Tesla showed up, he was blowing these guys away. He was just on a different planet. And they realized it, and they just wanted to harness as much of his stuff as possible and take the credit for it. So he definitely revolutionized American industry, and I think that his entire message was marginalized along with it. Because what happens is in 1916, they want to give him and Edison a joint Nobel Peace Prize for physics. And Edison, realizing that the prize itself, the $20,000, that if Edison gets that money, that if Tesla gets that money, he'll get back on his feet and he'll do this whole thing. He'll be back where he was, instead of begging Westinghouse for $75 a week. So he refuses to take the other half. So they have to basically say it's a null and void thing because it was a group prize. So that you have to get inside Edison's head. He's just jealous of this guy. He cannot afford to let this guy rise again. And really, you could say that about 1909 is where Tesla stops his really great innovations. Occasionally, he comes out there. But when he dies in 1943, it's under very obscure circumstances. He's been repressed for many years, and he's been kind of under the thumb of this establishment that's trying to minimize his work. And they did a great job, because really many of us, when we grew up, did not hear anything about Tesla. But the more you go into it, the more you realize this is somebody who revolutionized America and the world, really. So we go through a number of these different situations, and here's Tesla developing, this thought machine. He'll be able to project his pictures of people's thoughts on the wall. You know, he's got this other thing that's like the first early satellites. I mean, he's just advanced beyond advanced. And so with that suppression, they are able to keep him down, in fact. And by the time he dies, you know, it's a great mystery about where he's been keeping a lot of his work. And they have a lot, they've been keeping a 24/7 monitoring surveillance on Tesla on the FBI side. I'm going to show the documents tonight. Some of them documents that I don't think have ever been revealed because I've gone through the sources. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, the FBI released all their sources and all their documents on Tesla, and it's not hunky-dory. And you go through them and they're all blacked out. So how is that releasing anything? That's, you know, complete and utter censorship. But an interesting thing before we leave the topic of his early work is when he developed alternating current, he was working on it, and he said his mind was on fire and he couldn't eat or sleep. He was trying to figure out how to make this motor work with alternating current. And he went back and he got this little poem in his head that's a Goethe poem. And there is this line in there about follow and follow. And he stopped. He was walking with a friend who recorded this, where he just stopped in this park they were walking in, and he drew the whole formula down on the ground with a stick. This is the kind of altered state that Tesla could get into. And I have that poem here. I'm going to read it to you real quickly. You ready for some poetry there, Olivia?
I can't wait.
Olivia is very agreeable tonight. This is a good sign. Of course, you're watching Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to have so many people here. Wow, what an amazing crowd. And it's great because we're really getting down into the heart of it, the Trump Tesla episode. There's so much about the X technology that we're going to get into, and you can see those veils lifting around this. I do want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. And when you sign up for the newsletter, now you're going to get an email right away, and it'll say confirm your email address. Just hit that link and you're set. You're gold. That keeps us on board with each other, and it's really it's going to pay off in the future because there's a lot coming down the pike here with the X series that you don't want to miss. And that way, we'll send you an email about once a week, just letting you know what's happening with the show. Sign up for the show. I think it's $4 a year, $4 a month, $49 a year. Hey, if it was $4 a year, I guess everyone would sign up. But that's about as, you know, inexpensive. I just looked at it and said, what's the most inexpensive thing we can do? And that's what we did with it. So it's there. It's available for you. Sign up for it at darkjournalist.com. That kind of gives us the support. And it's always important, you know, we do it a lot with our stuff because we have to get behind the sources and alternative media that are giving us the important information, the things that we can actually use in our day-to-day life and aren't just giving us 2 minutes hate about, like, let's hate this political party or that one. We have to go deeper, I'm afraid, because one of the important things that's going on now is we're in such a period of time where it's kind of like use it or lose it. You know, get behind those sources and get behind those people that you want to see out there, giving you that service and giving you the real truth and the kind of developing that environment for transparency, I guess you'd say. And hey, right now is a fantastic time to do that because we have the people and we're here, you know, so it's a tremendous period of time. So let's make sure that we get behind shows and get behind the Dark Journalist show because we're going to be bringing you so much and we're going so deep on this level that it's going to be something that by the time we get to just, you know, the end of this round of the X series, the whole landscape has changed and transformed by the information that we bring forward. That's the kind of effect and the kind of impact. But I can tell you that we're at a point maybe of like 10 to 12% of this information. I mean, there's so much information around the X Steganography to share, and that's what we want to do. So, okay, here's the quote from Tesla. It's from Goethe's Faust. And it says, "The glow retreats, done as the day of toil. It yonder hastes. New fields of life exploring. Ah, no wing can lift me from the soil. Upon its track to follow, soaring." And it's the follow in Goethe's poem in Faust that gives us alternating current because the follow is the formula that Tesla needed. So right there, in the spiritual poetry. We can say we electrified the physical world. That's that mind-body symbiosis. But I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, which is apparently wherever Tesla was getting his information, it's not just textbooks. He was working on a whole different system in a whole different field. When he died, there's great confusion about what became of his work. But the person that they sent in, as we've described, was Professor John Trump. Professor John Trump was working in the RADLAB with Vannevar Bush, who was in charge of the UFO file. Professor John Trump was Vannevar Bush's protege. What does that tell us? Well, recently at a press conference, President Trump, in describing his uncle, said we were so close. He shared things with me. He told me about nuclear before nuclear was nuclear. In a Boston Globe article, he muses about his uncle and the impact he had on him. Now, his uncle must have known, one, all about the Tesla technology. Two, he was in the RADLAB. He had access to the most secret technology that we had. Three, Vannevar Bush was his protege. He was working with him in the RADLAB on the UFO file. He knows all about the UFO file. If Trump is close to his uncle and he's saying he's sharing secrets with me before nuclear was nuclear, then we're seeing that Trump knows all about the UFO file. But then it gets deeper because we have to start to say to ourselves, what is it about Trump? How does Trump show up on the scene, become this kind of, financial heavyweight in the 80s, and then develop this close relationship with, of all people, Richard Nixon, which is something we brought to light in this show, and then skyrocket into the presidency? What's really going on here behind the scenes? Let's start to understand a little bit about the influences of Trump. And this is President Donald Trump, who really is a political phenomenon right now, regardless of which way someone feels about him. It can't be denied that he really is the change. He's developed all kinds of policies in this country, and with the whole America First approach and Make America Great Again and all the rest of it, that are completely the opposite of what the Democrats had in place and have really upset a lot of the plans of the Davos crowd, the Amazons, the Facebooks, and all the rest of it. And they hate him, which is interesting because you have to wonder why when you get right down to it. Okay, let's look at this. We'll start from now and go backwards. And that says, Trump's Space Force will guard the U.S. from above, NASA chief said. That just came out yesterday. It will guard the U.S. from above. From what? Who's up there that's going to shoot at us? It seems, it's an unusual thing. There's no other space powers up there, so how is that going to defend us? Who is he talking about defending us from? We remember Star Wars. From the Reagan era, Star Wars SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was there to shoot down incoming Soviet missiles. Well, they don't say it's for incoming Soviet missiles. They say they're going to protect us from above. Quite interesting. Trump's major kind of spiritual influence, but I call him more of his inspirational coach, his personal Tony Robbins, was Norman Vincent Peale. And there he is at Norman Vincent Peale's 90th birthday party. That is Norman Vincent Peale along with Trump's first wife, Ivana. That's Ivana, right, Olivia?
Mm-hmm.
Olivia's great with names, by the way. Fantastic. Where would I be without you? So a little more from that party. We've got Trump with his wife and Norman Vincent Peale. Norman Vincent Peale, I believe in miracles, the power of positive thinking, this kind of thing. Absolute early Tony Robbins type of guy. Down here is Fred Trump. That is Trump's dad and John Trump's brother. And there is a shot over here on the very bottom of Norman Vincent Peale with Trump. A little more about Norman Vincent Peale. Norman Vincent Peale was a master mason. He was a 33 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason. It's really kind of the best of the best. And he was intergenerational Mason. That is, Masons in his family went back all through the 19th century. The Masonic lodges that across the country still use Norman Vincent Peale when they're recruiting new people, when they're putting out publications. Norman Vincent Peale is right in the heart of it. Now, let's take a look at Norman Vincent Peale's best friend. You ready? Best friend in his own words. Norman Vincent Peale, Richard Nixon. All right. So Nixon's, I got you, Olivia. Did you want to see that?
It's just shocking.
I know. Look at it. Do you want to see it?
Yeah, I do. Wow.
It is remarkable. Nixon shows up over and over again in the X investigations. There's no getting around it. Nixon is right there in the heart of the time capsule story. Nixon produced the documentary and funded the documentary that Robert Emenegger put out about UFOs Here and Now. And Nixon is at the core of these Pine Gap stories about unleashing this new energy system and energy source in 1975. This is what Nixon was going to do before he was taken out by the CIA in Watergate. We're going to get into that. But here we are, Norman Vincent Peale, best friends with Nixon, Trump's spiritual advisor, personal power advisor. By the way, Trump still mentions him in a fond light now. He still talks about him. But oddly enough, in all of this, Trump was very close to Nixon. And this is not something that's talked about very often. I talk about it a lot in this program because it's the key to so much of what we're doing with the X Steganography. Here's the picture of Nixon, John Connally, who was in the assassination car with JFK. He was in the front seat. He got shot. The whole magic bullet thing, supposedly the body being ricocheted 7 times by the same bullet that was getting shot out of Kennedy. Totally ridiculous. In fact, there were 13 bullets in that shooting. Here's Trump, and again with Ivana Trump. Now, I want you to think about politics for a minute. If you're Nixon, and if you're Trump, but especially if you're Nixon, you know politics, and you know that who you were seen with is absolutely important. Nothing is ever done haphazardly in politics. You show up with somebody, you take pictures with them because you want to send a message or reach a group somewhere. So who are they reaching with this picture? Well, the unavoidable thing besides the Trump-Nixon connection in this picture, and we find, of course, there are letters between the two in the National Archives, all about Nixon telling Trump to run for president in 1987. And in 1988, Trump gives it a pretty good thought for a while, but he waits on it. But the person in the middle here is John Connally, who was with JFK when he was assassinated. And it cannot be emphasized enough for these two people to show up for the first time in public together, Trump and Nixon, that John Connally is standing in the middle of them, because it represents something that happened earlier when the CIA assassinated President Kennedy. So there's messaging to that. I want to take a quick look at Kennedy for a moment and how Blue Gemini relates to all these things we're hearing about with the space program and how that all comes around to the Tesla technology. And we're going to go through the Tesla documents one at a time. And let me tell you, they are fascinating. So you're going to want to hear them. Here's Kennedy with Gordon Cooper at NASA. Kennedy was deep, well steeped in the program, the space program. He knew it was the absolute core of being the leader in the world. And he knew it was the future of humanity also. The other thing that he knew quite well was that the UFO file was something that was being hoarded by a very small group inside the national security state, and that he needed to take that power back. And you can see the 3 years of the Kennedy presidency as largely a struggle with the CIA and with the deep state to take a number of powers back, but essentially the UFO file is right at the core of that battle. There's no question about it. As a matter of fact, Kennedy insisted on having all the files back that he could share with the Soviet Union. He wanted to share, do this UFO sighting sharing. And what happened was he was thinking this will be good for our relations because if they see a UFO, they'll know it's not us, especially if we tell them what to look for. Going just a little bit deeper, how did he get to know all this? Well, he was very close friends with the first Defense Secretary of the United States, James Forrestal, here, who's shaking hands with Vannevar Bush, who is John Trump's mentor in the RADLAB. Again, here we have James Forrestal, the first Defense Secretary of the United States, shaking hands with Vannevar Bush, who we worked closely with on the UFO File and MJ-12. An interesting thing happens along the way to Forrestal, who was very close friends with his fellow Catholic, John F. Kennedy. As a matter of fact, when he's the Secretary of the Navy, Forrestal, he takes Kennedy over to war-torn Berlin after the war and shows him the reconstruction efforts. But he's known for sharing things with Kennedy, and they're very tight. One of the things that they laid on Forrestal is they made him part of the Majestic 12 group. And Vannevar Bush was the head of the group. But apparently, where this is with Harry Truman and James Forrestal, apparently where Forrestal parted companies, he thought this would be a great thing to make public, because if everyone knew about it, it would be, completely enlightening, and it would move the culture forward. There's a lot of different things. Whatever it happened to be, it bothered him on a deep level that they were going to keep it there. Strangely enough, there's a meeting where he voices his opinion. And almost as soon as he gets out the door, after they say, oh, thank you very much, thank you for sharing, he goes out, and then he's the target of all these different stories. Oh, when he, worked at these different financial firms, he was basically, a crook. He defrauded these people. Oh, he was cheating on his wife with his secretary and all the rest of it. And so they do a number of things, and he has an emotional breakdown very shortly after developing the position of defense secretary and being asked to join MJ-12. His disagreement with what they were doing with MJ-12, that is keeping it under a complete cloak of secrecy, apparently is what was behind them creating this program to get rid of him. And what they did, and it's very, very strange in the annals of national security history, but he gets checked in because of these people being concerned about him. That's a nice concern. He gets checked into Bethesda Naval Hospital, and then out the window he goes just a short while later from the 13th floor. So what is it we're to kind of take from that? Well, I have an episode called X Protect, which is all about this group that protects the UFO file at all costs. They will employ any means, including murder, including, largely discreditation is the way that they go, but disinformation and large-scale destruction. Here is a shot during his presidency. It's kind of a busy point of his presidency. He takes time out, John F. Kennedy, to visit the grave of James Forrestal. And I can only imagine he's thinking, they killed him for trying to do the same thing I'm trying to do, which is release the information to the public concerning the UFO file. This is pretty crucial because we're going to get into this with Trump and how that is all coming to bear now as well, that Trump stepping up to this position has a lot to lose, let's say. But Harry Truman, remember, was the person who developed MJ-12 with Vannevar Bush. Harry Truman was deep in the UFO file. He understood it. He had been the senator in Cape Girardeau when a major crash had taken place there, and they say that that helped with his ascension, which is that he handled that so well. And what he did was he employed Masonic means because he came from one of the biggest Masonic lodges in St. Louis. And his idea was, what we'll do with the UFO file and with these crashes and with the crash retrievals is we will bring in the Masonic secrecy codes, which we know no one can ever break once you're that kind of Mason. And interestingly enough, our friend Vannevar Bush used the same code for the RADLAB, and the Wall Street Journal would go on to say, there's better secrecy at the RADLAB than there is in most military institutions. which is really saying a lot when you think about it. A little more on Truman as I go over the political field here. That's Truman with Frank Edwards, who wrote a book called UFOs, Serious Business, and a number of other books that really cataloged the issue in detail and with great skill of an intellectual. Frank Edwards getting this information to Truman and sharing this information with Truman. Strangely enough, Frank Edwards will die of a cerebral hemorrhage just a couple of years later. And he seems to be one of these kind of targets of that X-Protect group in the 60s I'm talking about. Now, Truman had given the CIA all these powers, but shortly after Kennedy was assassinated, he went on the record and put out this whole editorial saying, you know what, this is out of hand completely. Let's make sure that they never get this kind of power. And let's either abolish them or bring them back to their official mandate, which is collecting intelligence, not controlling the world. So here's a shot of Truman with Kennedy before the assassination. I think he's giving them that message, which is don't let these guys get out of hand. And later, Allen Dulles, who's the head of the CIA, will go to Truman and say, you need to disavow that letter, immediately. Disavow that editorial. And supposedly he showed up that night to tell him this. And Truman said, look, there's no way you're going to threaten me. I've already been president. There's just no way to do it. So a lot of the kerfuffle and a lot of the clash that was taking place in the JFK administration was over this program. When we talk about a Space Force, this is really the first version of it. So when Trump says Space Force, think Blue Gemini. Blue Gemini was a UFO recon program that was being developed, and it got outside of the handle of Kennedy and his defense secretary, Robert McNamara. And what they decided to do is quite interesting. They decide to take it away from NASA and give it to the military. And there's a document that came out in 2014 that was declassified speaking about Blue Gemini. And it's Robert McNamara saying, what's going on over there? It's almost as if we have two different space programs. Now, this whole thing that, when I've talked about the secret space networks that are out there and how there was a separate program that was kept in the black budget, and the work of Catherine Austin Fitts and Joseph Farrell has brought it up. This is the first substantial documentation to actually say it outright. And I am going to read that later, but let's keep moving on. This generation of X planes is getting developed in this period. And so little by little, it's getting out of the hand of the president and the executive branch. And it's going into these corporate hands mixed with these deep state hands, groups inside the intelligence community, oil interests, and all the rest of it. They are controlling the technology. So the job of the president, especially in JFK's case, but even before that with Eisenhower, is to try to get some of that power back underneath their umbrella. The X-planes, it's well known now. So here we have an article. Here are the X-planes, some of the most ambitious and secretive flying machines ever made. And the X-planes come all out of the work of Walter Dornberger. Walter Dornberger is the paperclip scientist that we brought over here who was in charge of the rocket program and whose understudy was von Braun, who's the famous rocket scientist Nazi that we took over here to head up NASA's rocket program. Now, you can understand on the surface why they did some of that, because they had some of the best minds. The problem is there's something about absorbing the ideology that was behind these guys that was maybe problematic. And they had this problem in the Soviet Union also when they did that. There's just something that there seemed to be these forces working in the post-war Germany, the post-war Nazi field to kind of reacquire power. We have to be very cautious of that. Lockheed Martin, of course, developed the X Blackbird, and that's where the X program sits now, along with the X-37B. This is the outcome of all of that work. But interestingly enough, Walter Dornberger's program, which he brought forward, the X-15 and the X-20, the X-15 still holds the record per space plane, even though it was flown in the 60s. This is how advanced the stuff was. So Dornberger was the person who's working with the UFO file and kind of commingling that with what they have, the advanced Nazi program, to create this X technology. That's where all the X's are coming from. And we're going to do a show that singles out just the X technology. Here's a shot of Blue Gemini in action. It kind of looks like the top of a champagne bottle. This is the way to describe it. But this program was the program that was in effect that Kennedy decided to scrap, and that the deep state decided their best revenge was to reignite it as soon as they got rid of them. Another quick look at this. They have it listed here as Project Mercury, but it's essentially the same capsule, and there's a manned, it's the first manned capsule. And it's basically what was happening, according to Philip Corso, who came out, Colonel Philip Corso came out with so much information dealing with this period and what they were doing with the technology, and I think it's so helpful. What he said was that basically these were UFO recon craft. So what they were doing is they were chasing these craft. And the idea is that in chasing the craft, they would get an idea of their speeds and all the rest of it. So much of the X program, and the reason that it goes into the black budget, is because it's feeding the UFO file. It's giving them information. So they can't come out and make that public because they're keeping it under this, behind this wall of secrecy. Okay, so we're starting to get the picture a little bit now. We've got the political connections. We've got Trump together with Nixon. We've got Nixon having observed this whole process with Kennedy and the Blue Gemini program. And we're looking at Walter Dornberger, one of the paperclip scientists who developed this entire program. But what we're getting to in the early space program is we're looking at these figures and we're saying, why was there the assassination of Kennedy in this? And why did they remove Nixon? And why is there all this space stuff in the middle of it? What is the UFO file and what are the X letters all about? And how does that relate to Trump and the X letters and the X technology and Tesla? We have to put all those things together, and that's what we're going to do in the next half hour here. By going through the actual FBI records that show us where the Tesla information landed eventually. And it is a fascinating process. And the book that I'm going to recommend on it is called Tesla, Man Out of Time by Margaret Cheney. Well, don't worry, there's no relation there to Dick Cheney. But before I get into all that, I would like to check in with Olivia. How are we doing over there?
Good. Do you want a question right now?
Please do.
Cutting through the fog just asked, the Mercury capsule couldn't chase anything. Does he mean things like the X-15?
The X-15 is the capsule that I was referencing. Okay. It's a space plane, and that's the one that Walter Dornberger got up to the fastest speed that still holds the record. And interestingly enough, Philip Corso is the one who gave us the why for why they created it in the first place. It's for UFO recon. The capsules, the idea is you want something to be able to chase a UFO with UFO recon, but they were developing the capsules anyway. So when they're sending people up for observation, not all the capsules are going to be able to chase the UFO, but they're developing the space planes along Dornberger's program for that very purpose. But yeah, thanks. What else you got?
I got a lot. It depends which way you want to go.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, Ice Angel is asking, does DJ think Trump is a puppet for Mr. Global?
Well, I think that they've had some problems with him, some problems controlling him. I think it remains to be seen what's going to happen there. I think there's great promise in the fact that Trump got around their election apparatus because they were ready for Cold War 2.0 and war with Russia. They wanted to bomb Syria and all the rest of it. And Trump has kind of gone along a little bit with the Syrian part, but he's totally been open to a better relationship with Russia for sure. So it's fascinating. I think it remains to be seen. There's a lot of encouraging signs on one hand and a lot of signs that aren't so encouraging, for example. So like John Bolton and the neocon agenda slipping in to the Trump administration. Seems to me he's the kind of guy who can sum up the situation, and but it also, it remains to be seen if he's going to be manipulated or not. So there's no real way, I think, to say right now I think it's an open case. And if anything, it seems like the deep state was so hardcore to get him. And all that testimony with Peter Strzok tells us the FBI were trying to take him out. So you have to ask the question, beyond the partisanship, why? So it is fascinating. Like, great question.
Want to take one more?
Okay.
Okay. David Tormina, DJ. Based upon your research, what is the furthest level of space travel the X program has achieved?
Well, I think they've gone deep space. I don't think there's any question about it. But I think in terms of what we can prove, you know, certainly the X-37B is the height publicly of that program. But I think they've taken that program pretty deep into space. But since we mentioned X-15, let's talk about X-15 real briefly and Walter Dornberger, and that will lead us directly into the Tesla file. Okay. Walter Dornberger, as I said, was Wernher von Braun's Nazi superior in the space program. Absolutely genius with rockets. And what he does when they are firing off the V2 rockets to go kind of blow away England, he turns to von Braun and he says, "Do you realize what we accomplished today? Today the spaceship was born." Keep that in mind. Dornberger is interesting for a number of reasons, but one, since I'm really kind of going heavy on Blue Gemini tonight with this, because I think it's crucial when we talk about the Space Force to get it right. I've pointed this out a few times, but Ruth and Michael Payne are two people associated with Walter Dornberger. Michael Payne is his understudy at Bell Helicopter. When Dornberger's heading up Bell Helicopter, Michael Payne is his understudy. Ruth Payne is his wife. Ruth Payne's mom is in something called the Nine, which is this interesting clairvoyant group, which is trying to contact aliens, basically. And they think that they're in touch with these kind of super terrestrial beings, giving them all this information. And Arthur Young and all these people are in this group. And it's an incredibly wealthy group. The Astors are in the group. Trust me, the Astors are going to come on with a vengeance here very shortly. But Ruth and Michael Payne have something else to their credit, which is that they become the hosts to Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of President Kennedy, and which is, you know, a farce, as we've seen many times on this program. And all of the information that is used to incriminate Oswald comes out of the Payne household. So that gives us a great idea of the association of Dornberger, Bell Helicopter, with the Kennedy assassination. That group inside NASA, the post-war Nazi paperclip scientists influencing that group and being there hand in glove, basically directly with Oswald, who's going to be set up as the patsy. Quite fascinating indeed. There's a shot of the X-15, which still holds records for the space plane for its speed. And, you know, it's described as a hypersonic rocket-powered aircraft, and it's credited to Dornberger. It's the kind of the height of his program early on, 1959. The X-15 was based on a concept study from Walter Dornberger for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. So there's no question there. It's not a guess. It's not a conspiracy. It's Dornberger's X program, and Dornberger was convicted at Nuremberg, by the way, and was going to be hung. So he had used slave labor and they had run concentration camps and used slave labor to build the V2 rockets. So it's pretty dark. I mean, it's a dark chapter anyway. But the idea of these people being associated with the space program and with the JFK assassination is a mind blower, and it has to give us pause as we go forward into it. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper. Now, we use the term very often about X. And, you know, in popular culture, you have the X Files. And what does that come from? It comes out of the FBI, actually, because the FBI had an X security matter file. And they sent this person around who was an FBI chief in Chicago to check it out. And he went all over the country checking it out. And he would investigate these sightings, and there are news reports with him in there, you know, and drawings of these saucers that he's doing, and he's tracking down the UFO program. And he's actually quite an interesting character. His name is Guy Bannister. And later, he will show up, just to make things a little more intriguing, as the employer of Lee Harvey Oswald. So Oswald, under the employ of Guy Bannister, is doing all of these things, pretending to be a Cuban agitator and all these different things, where we know very well that the work that Guy Bannister's doing is all about this right-wing stuff. But a decade earlier, he was the UFO man for the FBI. Let's keep that in mind as we get into the next set of documents, because that's going to open up a lot. Can't help but point out there is the JFK picture. This is just a couple minutes before the assassination, but that's a major fork in the road. That is, everything changes for the deep state. The deep state becomes the dominant state, and the public state becomes subordinate to the deep state. That is a major changeover, and it affects everything that we're talking about in terms of the X technologies it's getting along. One of the things that we can thank Jim Garrison for in his JFK investigation is running across Guy Bannister. But here's something that nobody caught in that investigation. Strangely enough, Guy Bannister would die himself just a year after the assassination or less. It was like 8 months after the assassination. They could not leave him with all the information that he had pertaining to the assassination just hanging out there. So what they did was quite fascinating. They killed him, and they got rid of most of his documents. However, interestingly enough, his wife kept some of his files. And a few years later, she tried to sell them to different archives and things like that. But one of the interesting things is that the actual files weren't there relating to 1963, but the names, the listing of the names of what he had there for 1963 was still there. And I have all those for you right here. And right in the middle of all these, like Fidel Castro and Cuban Revolutionary Council and assassination of President Kennedy, right on the bottom here, before Guy Bannister is killed, is Dinosaur. Dinosaur Space Warcraft. 15 and 16, files 15 and 16. Now, this is Guy Bannister, again, who was in charge of the UFO file for the FBI in the late 40s and early 50s, goes to New Orleans, opens an office, becomes this anti-communist agitator, sends Oswald out to pretend he's a Cuban to infiltrate student groups and things like that, preps him, gives him this background, so Oswald has this background where people will see him saying, well, I'm a communist on TV and things like that. So when he's grabbed for the Kennedy assassination, everyone's just like, oh, he's this crazy communist, move on. But Guy Bannister, I think, is quite significant because Dinosaur Space Warcraft, first of all, Dinosaur is the X-20 program, which replaced Blue Gemini. And that program is another one of these programs that goes black and reemerges later in the 60s. The X-20 name on Dinosaur is, that's kind of the height of what we had for space travel at the time. But they just talked about it in terms of a surveillance craft and space exploration. Interestingly enough, in Guy Bannister's file drawer name, Dinosaur is Space Warcraft. So again, the X-20 is being developed after Blue Gemini as a warcraft. This is what Kennedy was trying to prevent from happening there. He knows that's where they were going. There's the patch for Dinosaur. And there's a lot of controversy around Dinosaur as well, and that becomes a black program. But we've touched on it before, but just to keep it all in the family here. So we're seeing now that with the Space Force and with the problems with Blue Gemini and the CIA and the paperclip people trying to take over the space program, that Kennedy and Trump have a lot in common. From that perspective, there's no question about it, being the outsiders who are coming in to a system that's already developed. Okay. So in this document relating to these UFO sightings in 1947, we have this designation here. It is SMX. That is Security Matter X. And this is the stuff that Guy Bannister was handling, but the FBI is using this X, and that's going to become very crucial in about a minute here. Here we have, this is another one with this J. Edgar Hoover saying, give me more information about these UFO sightings and all the rest of it. Okay, before we go any further, that's the letter I alluded to. I often show this picture, and this is the picture. Dear Donald, with the letter. I did put out the program. Mrs. Nixon told me you were great on the Donahue show. And basically, it's December 21st, 1987, and our friend, Richard Nixon, is encouraging his friend, Donald Trump, to run for presidency and saying he'll win. And I predict you'll win. Of course, the person who's making all the predictions for Nixon, because Nixon's not just making predictions with his wife, but it's Gene Dixon, who is his main person, the go-to. And they found this out in, especially during the 9/11 terrorism commissions, when they were looking at this connection between Gene Dixon showing up at the White House or being on the telephone with Nixon over 80 times. And she is giving him advice on what to do next and, you know, where to go and how it is. And what I've said about Gene Dixon, and we should keep this in mind as we look at her, she was at one point the most powerful woman in the world, in my opinion, being that close with the presidents. And it turns out she's been giving that kind of advice since 1944 and FDR. So she goes all the way through that to the Reagan era. Incredible. But it also goes to show that these presidents are using these oracles. They're using these psychics. They're basing many decisions on this psychic information that they're getting. And this goes into that mystery school connection that we make so much of in the show, but there's a reason for that. Okay, so Guy Bannister. I think we've seen that he developed this X program for the FBI. Now let's see what they did with it. Or did he inherit it? More likely, he did inherit it. This is a document that is from the Department of Justice and is about J. Edgar Hoover talking about Tesla before he died. And the year is 1940, September 24th, and I'm going to read it here briefly. And I'll remind you that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's great to have everyone here. I am excited that we're getting deep into the Tesla-Trump connection, because that is at the very crux of the X series, and the connections run deep, I'm telling you. So we're giving you a very round picture, and it is the wide-angle lens tonight. But this is the way that we kind of get the best results. Now it makes more sense. The focus starts to come together. How are we doing, Miss Olivia?
We are doing great. I've got way too many questions already.
Okay, well, we'll be taking questions shortly. And I definitely think that, you know, the Trump UFO file, Tesla questions take precedence. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, make a long story short, what J. Edgar Hoover is asking for here, he says, if as the author states, the teleforce has been perfected by Nikola Tesla. Teleforce is the death ray, basically, that he's been working on, supposedly. It would be a measure of foresightedness. There's a word for it. I don't use that one too much. Foresightedness, to ensure his constant guarding against being molested, possibly kidnapped and tortured by alien enemies. It's kind of a fascinating phrase. Of course, speaking in World War II, any other country, I guess, is an alien. It's just a weird term, isn't it? Alien enemies? For the purposes of seizing the secret of such an invaluable instrument of war. Okay, so what he's saying is here, let's do 24/7 surveillance on him, more or less. Other groups had already been watching him anyway, but the FBI is making it formal there. Some of these documents, I think, when we look at them, are kind of earth-shattering, because I want to get to the best ones, though, since our time is limited. And again, the book that I recommended on this was Tesla, Man Out of Time. Yeah, well, I'm going to read a few excerpts from that. Here's just a couple of thoughts that she's having when she's looking at the case. She says, since he was part of no group or institution, he had no colleagues with whom to discuss work in progress, no formal, accessible repository for his research notes and papers. He worked not just in private, but his love of flamboyant announcements and press notwithstanding, in secret. Thus, any inventions which he did not patent or give freely to the world were more or less shrouded in mystery. That is, there's a lot of things very much like the mystery schools where Tesla is looking at the world and saying, can the world handle this? Now, when he tries to give the world something they can use, like free wireless energy, they basically box him away, and they use the innovations like alternating current and take credit for it. So you can see why some of these things gave him pause. But she says, because of the handling of the papers he left behind after his death, the range of his achievements continues to remain a partial mystery. Excellent observation. Okay, let's go further. Now, immediately after Tesla's death, an exchange of telegrams flew between FBI agents Foxworth in New York and the New York Bureau and director of the FBI. The day following the discovery of the body, Agent Foxworth explained, experiments and research of Nikola Tesla, deceased, espionage. Nikola Tesla, one of the world's outstanding scientists in the electrical field, died January 7th, 1943, at the Hotel New Yorker, New York City. During his lifetime, he conducted many experiments in connection with wireless transmission of electrical power, what is commonly called the death ray. According to information furnished by X, obviously it's some kind of informant they have named X, New York City and the notes and records of Tesla's experiments, formulate together with designs of machinery, are among Tesla's personal effects, and steps must be taken to preserve them or keep them from falling into the hands of people unfriendly to the war effort. Then, interestingly enough, this whole thing circles round to President X, Henry Wallace, in this next line. Watch this. The FBI was, however, advised by the office of Vice President Henry Wallace that the government was vitally interested in preserving and obtaining Tesla's papers. Okay? There's Henry Wallace stepping in, keeping a close eye on Tesla's stuff. Henry Wallace coming out of Theosophy the same way Annie Besant had kept an eye on John Keely's work at the turn of the century. Those groups, the mystery schools, are staying right on the surface watching this situation. Okay, so this is something that I think we all need to kind of get on board with it. I'm going to read a little more here, so bear with me, but it's all going to a really important place. So now what's happening is people are getting concerned. Some of the Yugoslav ambassador to the United States was a nephew of Tesla's, and he gets in the middle of all this, and he says, well, I want Tesla's belongings and stuff, and I hear people broke into his safe, and what's going on here, basically. So what happens is the author says here, Margaret Cheney in the book, the relevant records I've obtained from federal agencies under the Freedom of Information Act reveal strange twistings and inconsistencies in the handling of the inventor's estate. Tesla left tons of papers, barrels, and boxes full of them, but he left no will. He was survived by 5 nieces and nephews, of whom 2 lived in America at the time of his death. Curiously, the FBI released his estate to the Office of Alien Property, which promptly sealed the contents. Since Tesla was an American citizen, the OAP's concern in the matter was hard to justify. After a court hearing, however, the estate was released to Ambassador Kosanovic, one of the heirs. And this is where the story gets really kind of wild. Soon, the well-known electrical engineer, Dr. John Trump, who was serving as a technical aide to the National Defense Research Committee, Office of Scientific Research and Development, that's all Vannevar Bush, was asked to participate in examination of Tesla's scientific papers present at the Manhattan Warehouse and Storage. Okay, so he goes in. There's a whole thing where I've seen these videos of John Trump talking about this whole process. And along the way, the FBI agents say, what we're really looking for is that device that he has for pulling down flying objects at a distance. So they're concerned about pulling down these flying objects, and that all relates to the UFO file. Reading through it here. Dr. Trump's abstract included the following, because remember what they usually say with Trump, and when he looked at the papers, it's like, oh, there's nothing here that would really, enemy country would be interested in, just move along. But interestingly enough, his full abstract contains this. The art of teleo dynamics, or art of producing terrestrial motions at a distance. This document, in the form of a letter dated June 12, 1940, to the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, proposes a method for the transmission of large amounts of power over vast distances by means of mechanical vibrations of the Earth's crust. The source of the power is a mechanical or electromechanical device bolted to some rocky protuberances and imparting power at a resonance frequency of the Earth's crust. The proposed scheme appears to be completely visionary. So what he's saying is, in here, there's the innovation that he's talking about. This is the stuff that you want, and this is the stuff that's left out of the public record. But now we have it. So in that whole exchange, we learned quite a few things, which is that Trump had seen something in those papers that related to basically a gigantic wireless free energy device which pulled energy from the Earth's crust. That's the thing that they were after. This thing about the death ray is a total joke, I'm convinced. So a couple more quotes, and then we're going to move into taking a look at these documents, and then we'll move to your questions. You're watching Dark Journalist, and it's fantastic to have everyone here. What a crowd. Just fantastic. I couldn't ask for anything more than that. We're joined by the lovely and absolutely fascinating Olivia. And Olivia has had so many interesting ideas. We've really played ping pong with so many interesting ideas this week. And she's been doing great. She's taking your questions over there and guiding everybody, which I really appreciate because she does it so well. Now, John Trump describes what happens when the FBI agents say, look, go in there, supposedly be careful though, because we think it's a bomb or something. So he goes in there and he checks it out, and he finds this very handsome, polished wooden chest bound with brass. It required a final effort of courage to raise the lid, and the FBI agents were like, wait, you go raise the lid, we'll stand back here. Now, according to Trump, inside stood a multi-decade resistance box of the type used for Wheatstone bridge resistance measurements, a common standard item to be found in every electrical laboratory before the turn of the century. This is fascinating. Tesla has discovered that at the turn of the century, the way that he was able to tweak this machine, that he can still use it as this advanced thing, and that is that Wheatstone bridge resistance thing. Interestingly enough, one of the companies that is offering these older bridge resistance, Wheatstone bridge resistance measurements, the company itself is called X Tech, which I found hilarious. That's probably just one of those things, a coincidence, but how odd can you get? Okay, let's really cut to the chase here now. This is the crucial part. So what happens is, supposedly, the Office of Alien Affairs takes Tesla's stuff and releases it to his nephew, who is the ambassador from Yugoslavia. Right? Everything's hunky-dory. Not so. As it turns out, they didn't do that. Second of all, according to that office, they never had any of Tesla's stuff. Third of all, the military goes looking for it in 1947. They want it all. They don't know where it is. So who took it? Let's take a look at this exchange from military intelligence in Washington. Looking now to that office, OAP, trying to find out where's Tesla's stuff. Between 1945 and 1947, still quoting from Tesla Man Out of Time, excellent book by Margaret Cheney, highly recommend it. Between 1945 and 1947, an interesting exchange of letters and cables occurred among the Air Technical Service Command in Wright Field, Ohio. Okay, you know Wright-Patterson? That's where all the UFO material is stored. Okay. Roswell stuff, all that gets shipped over there. Study of the UFO file, basically, Wright Field is where you go. Wright Field, Ohio, in whose equipment laboratory much top-secret research was being performed. Yeah, that's an understatement of the century. Military intelligence in Washington and the Office of Alien Properties. Subject, files of the late Nikola Tesla. On August 21st, 1945, the Air Technical Service Command requested permission from the commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Force in Washington, D.C., for Private Blois Fitzgerald to go to Washington for a period of 7 days for the purpose of securing property clearance on enemy impounded property. On September 5th, 1945, Colonel Holliday of the Equipment Laboratory Propulsion and Accessories Subdivision wrote to Roy Shawless of the OAP in Washington, confirming a conversation with Fitzgerald and asking for photostatic copies of the exhibits, which we're going to look at, annotated by Trump from the estate of Tesla. That's John Trump. It was stated that the material would be used in connection with projects for the national defense by this department, and that all of it would be returned at a reasonable length of time. That was the last time the Office of Alien Property or any other federal agency in the United States admitted to having possession of Tesla's papers on beam weaponry. Shawless wrote to Colonel Holliday in September 11, 1945, saying, "The materials requested have been forwarded to Air Technical Command Service Command in the care of Robert Hooley. These data are made available to the Army Air Force by this office for use in experiments. Please return them." They were never returned. Okay, 4 months after the photostats had been sent to Wright Field, Colonel Ralph Doty, okay, D-O-T-Y. Now, everyone knows so much about Richard Doty. And I have to admit that Richard Doty's background is so, I know that his dad was in the military, but his background is cloaked. And so I'm trying to obtain right now if he's related to this Colonel Ralph Doty, who was the chief of military intelligence in Washington. Now, what happens is this Doty, who is this guy in this picture here, and I'll go further into him. Don't worry, we're not going to lose him. He goes and talks to this James Markham of Alien Property, which supposedly has all the Tesla papers, because that's where they were given initially to them, and then they shipped off some stuff supposedly to his nephew, but that never happened. Okay. So Doty says, hey, look, they've never been received. What happened? This office is in receipt of a communication from headquarters, Air Technical Command, Wright Field, requesting that we ascertain the whereabouts of the files of the late scientist Nikola Tesla, which may contain data of great value to the above headquarters. It's been indicated that your office might have these files in custody. That's what the FBI said. If this is true, we would like to request your consent for a representative of the Air Technical Service Command to review them. In view of the extreme importance of these files to the above command, we'd like to request that we be advised of any attempt by any other agency to obtain them. Okay, so now it's becoming territorial. Where's the stuff? And if anyone else asks for it, tell us. Because of the urgency of this matter, this communication will be delivered to you by a liaison officer in this office in hope of expediting the solicited information. The other agency that had the files or should have had them was Air Technical Service Command itself. Colonel Doty's letter was classified under the Espionage Act until May 1980. So they have this huge back and forth going on. And what I'll tell you is there is a response from the Office of Alien Property, from Colonel Duffy. And this is where I'm going to end this section. But what he does is he says, these reports are now in the possession of the electronic subdivision and are being evaluated. He believed the evaluation would be completed by January 1st, 1948. At that time, your office will be contacted with respect to the final disposition of these papers. And then he never hears from them again. So over the years, they've had a really hard time explaining what happened to his papers, and the military is trying to get them, but it's the military saying, look, you know, we need it for Wright-Patterson research relating to the UFO file. Where is it? And the Office of Alien Property is saying, first, we don't have it. Then later, oh, they're being looked at. We'll get them to you at some other point. And then later saying, oh, we never had them. So these papers disappear, in essence. There's no government body that will admit to having them. Now we're going to see what the actual FBI documents say. There's Colonel Ralph Doty again. Very interesting player in all this, and the key, I would say, to what the military wanted to do with the Tesla papers. Okay. First of all, the papers that the FBI released relating to Tesla's papers and instructions, all blacked out. But you see the X's everywhere here that denote these are the things relating to the X technology. This is how they keep track of it. And you might say, well, it's a casual X on these documents. When you look at these documents, they don't have that, especially since when you see confidential, And then you have X stamped on the confidential, right? If it's confidential, why do you need the X also? Now, remember, with every steganography, someone can come up with a document and say, hey, the FBI used X for this or that. It's not the point. Steganography is supposed to be hidden in plain sight. It's supposed to look normal. This is how it's supposed to look. But for our purposes, in tracking the Tesla technology and tracking the UFO file, it's the X steganography that we're looking for. And there's where we find it, stamped on top of confidential, which is a double mess. Here's more of those documents. Why are they blacking that stuff out 70 years later? Doesn't make any sense. You know, we hear all this stuff, oh, hey, you know, the FBI released these records. They really released the fluff documents. This is what we got. Okay. And here's how the end game plays out. Again, another confidential X document, but this one we can read. Let's see what it says. Again, this all relates to the Trump-Tesla connection around the UFO file and the X technology. Okay, here we go. Now, this is from 1981, it's the federal government. Papers recovered on the death of Nikola Tesla. Memo for the director of the FBI. From the Undersecretary of Defense. Here we're going to see a push-pull between the military and the FBI. We understand the FBI may have possession of a number of papers found after the death of Nikola Tesla in 1943. This is the military asking for it in 81. Which agency took it? If the military doesn't have it, who has it? And Nikola Tesla was a brilliant electrical engineer, created the Tesla coil. He was a pioneer in various aspects of electrical transmission phenomena. We believe that certain of Tesla's papers may contain basic principles which would be considerable value to certain ongoing research within the DoD. It would be very helpful to have these papers. Since we really have no idea of the possible volume of these papers, we'd be happy to provide a researcher, so on and so forth. And then we have a response over here, which is to acknowledge the receipt of your request. In response to your request, the files pertaining to Nikola Tesla, please be advised that in order to, this is from the director of the FBI, Clarence M. Kelly. Please be advised that in order to preserve the privacy of an individual who may be the subject of a similar inquiry, it's been necessary for the FBI to maintain the practice of not indicating whether we do or do not have such information in our files. In essence, saying, I'm not going to tell you if we've got it or if we don't. If you can provide notarized authorization from Mr. Tesla's next of kin directing us to release to you any information our files may contain concerning him, we shall thereafter search our files and advise you accordingly. Since we have not conducted a search of our files, please do not infer that we do or do not have the information that you've requested. So complete whitewash from the FBI. Obviously, what it sounds like is that the FBI took the information, pretended it was with the alien office, and stonewalled the military. But who did they give it to for development? After all, wouldn't you give it to your military? Obviously, there's a group in there that I call X Protect, which handles everything relating to the X technology and around the UFO file. That's the category it slipped into, and nobody can get at that thing. That's why when we go through these different programs, like when we're talking about Blue Gemini, and we're talking about some of the researchers, people like Garrison who ran into Bannister, they run up against this thing. And this is the same thing that we see now with Trump trying to get a handle on the Space Force. And with the Clinton group, when they were coming in, trying to use Tom DeLonge to come in with this little CIA mirage around the ATIP program and the To the Stars Academy and all that junk came out of this Podesta Clinton effort, trying to get at that same thing. So whatever it is and whoever has it, it's in this little narrow corridor, and it relates to that whole massive secrecy around the UFO file and the X tech, whatever it happens to be. We've looked at presidents signing on with X letters saying this can't be opened until 2053 or 2023. And we've seen our best inventors there. They hunker down. Somebody like Tesla obviously figured out something relating directly to that X technology that they don't want out. So it's quite an elaborate situation. And then we think of the main players in there, like Trump and Nixon, and that whole relationship between Norman Vincent Peale and Nixon. We're starting to see how Nixon set up Trump to be the president that could crack the information, because Nixon himself wanted to bring that information out in the 70s and was railroaded by the CIA, who didn't want that information coming out for whatever reason. But what is the core thing that we mentioned about Trump's advisor, spiritual advisor, whatever we want to call him, Norman Vincent Peale, who's also close and best friends with Nixon? He's a Mason, and he's an intergenerational master Mason. So we go back to the very heart of the X Steganography, sitting right in the middle of the foundation of America, which is that most of the American Revolution was done by the Masons, which is one of the major mystery schools. So we are, in dealing with the space program, in dealing with the Space Force, in dealing with Trump, in dealing with Tesla and his X technology, in the middle of a battle between mystery schools, and it's coming out in terms of the deep state battle over technology and secrecy and political dominance by a very small group inside that national security state who controls what? They control the X technology, which generally comes out of the UFO file. This is the conclusion that we can reach by looking at this, but the battle goes on almost on a daily basis. That's where the Space Force comes from. You know, when Trump came up to the microphone and started talking about the Space Force, it just kind of doesn't make sense. He didn't really say what it was for, which was fascinating. That's why the NASA chief came out and said, well, it's to protect us from anything that would attack us from above. Like what? Killer satellites? It's quite remarkable. And let's remember that Truman, who set up MJ-12 with Vannevar Bush, who was the mentor to John G. Trump, he's a master Mason. So you've got the mystery schools positioning themselves against each other. That's the battle that's ongoing that we're seeing here. And with that, I will turn it over to Olivia, who is really, she's getting the deep inspiration around these questions.
All right. I just wanted to start. Subtle Energy over 9,000 said, I was hoping DJ would say kerfuffle again, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to say it.
Now that you made me conscious of it, I'll probably never say it again. This is the problem.
Okay, so WMGN asks, have you seen or heard of Murder in the Air 1940 with Ronald Reagan based on Tesla's death ray?
Oh, wow. That's great. Well, we know that Reagan was in a lot of great B movies. And there was a lot of rumors. There were all kinds of things about Tesla and the death ray. And there's no doubt that he talked about this. But I think what the FBI diverted to, they said, well, he talked in the press about a death ray. That gives us the right to break into his place and steal stuff from his safe and steal his papers. But it is really fascinating what the death ray was all about. And we never got to the bottom of that either. I'm thinking that he didn't trust the military powers with it. That's my guess. Okay, keep going.
Okay, I'm going to start with a bunch of questions about the Space Force, because that seems to be what people are most passionate about. So Vicky Ledgard says, do you think the creation of the Space Force indicates something is going to happen?
I think outing the Space Force, that is saying that the Space Force is going to be developed as the sixth branch of the armed services, is a change, a sea change. Now, Trump tried to get the Space Corps in October, and Congress booted him on that. He did reopen the Space Council by presidential executive order, and that was in I think it was June of last year. And it was weird because when he did it, he had Pence there and the former Secretary of State, which was an odd choice because the Secretary of State is all about relations, and he's saying, oh, we're going to the moon and Mars. Why do they have the Secretary of State there? It didn't make a whole lot of sense. But him opening the Space Council, I think, is a definite message that he plans to benefit, and that he's not going to be one of these presidents out of the loop relating to the UFO file. He has the information from John Trump. John Trump was in the program with Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush led the UFO file. That was according to who? Robert Sarbarker. Well, why is Robert Sarbarker a non-person? Let's think about this. Sarbarker was the physicist who said that, what was his big crime? He said that Vannevar Bush was the head of the UFO file. Now, he's practically written out of the history books. Yes, you can find things on it, little things. But this guy was on the level of Robert Oppenheimer. I mean, he was the star physicist of the country. There he is in the Saturday Evening Post in 1950 being celebrated. So how did he lose his reputation? Here he is now. Robert Sarbarker does not exist, according to Wikipedia. Why? Why? Why is there no page in Wikipedia for Dr. Robert Sarbarker? Well, two things. He let out the fact that Vannevar Bush was ahead of the UFO program. He talked about working on redeveloping UFOs, and he identified his successor in the program that led it after Vannevar Bush. Who was that? Arthur Compton. Interestingly enough, Arthur Compton gave us the X-10 graphite nuclear reactor and was working with his brother Carl at MIT with Vannevar Bush. But he also shows up as A.H. Comas. And we're going to get into this in the next episode. Who is Compton? Well, Compton is the reason why Sarbarker is a non-person. Okay, keep going.
Okay, Subtle Energy over 9,000 asks again, can you ask DJ what he thinks about Tesla being celibate, or what he thought about him destroying his manhood to focus on his work after the relationship with a French stage actress?
I think there are these guys who they're so committed to what they're doing that anything like, you know, having a normal life, like raising a child or being married or in love, interferes with their prime mission. And it's a very interesting thing with him because he seems absolutely and completely obsessed with his work, but he's also living in an altered state, which for my money is how he gets so much of that information. And I think other people around him might interfere with that, and he might have realized that early on. But it is fascinating. I mean, basically next to no love life. And, you know, he comes off very much like an alien. There's no question about it. He is the inventor who fell to Earth, and he gave us so many great things. Okay.
JJK, is it true that Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, visited Tesla's lab at night?
Wow. Thank you for calling Mark Twain by his real name. I'll never forget my mother being so excited finding a book by Samuel Clemens and realizing it was Mark Twain. And it is quite interesting. Well, I will say this, that their relationship, Twain, like Edison, was somebody that a young Tesla looked up to. You know, Tesla had a lot of problems in his childhood. When he was 5, his brother died in a horse accident, and he went into a deep depression. He developed an early illness of cholera, and you know, a number of things happened to him that kind of left him between worlds. And his dad wanted him to be an Orthodox priest like he was, but he had no interest in that. He was all electrical, and you know, he pushed forward in this fashion. But I think when we're looking at Tesla, we're looking at a very, very unusual genius. There's no question about it. Okay.
Titan-blooded, was Tesla involved in any mystery schools?
Well, now it's fascinating. One of the things in the FBI files that I found that was so interesting is when they were tracking all the different people who were showing up for him, they said, well, he spends all of his time with these Astors in New York. And the Astors are very connected. They were connected to the Nine, which is kind of a little mystery cult. But I want to show something about the Astors that I think is significant. Here is that document where it says, known associates of Nikola Tesla, FBI file. Mrs. John Jacob Astor, Lady Ribblesdale, now living in the U.S., Park Ave Plaza. She's the mother of Vincent Astor and financed many of Tesla's developments in 1910, and their family may have data of importance. Okay, that's the document that's here on the bottom. That's an FBI official document. Let's take a quick look at the Astors. I've highlighted them in a program. I'm trying to think of what episode that was. I'm thinking it's episode 7. But John Jacob Astor went down with the Titanic, actually, and he was known as a real visionary. One of the things he did was he authored a science fiction book, which was quite incredible, and it related to life in the year 2000. He wrote it in 1893. It's called A Journey to Other Worlds. And he had an incredible sense for space at this period of time. And he funded John Keeley, who makes an appearance finally in this episode. John Keeley's project of this kind of psychic flying machine, for want of a better word. But Astor was a very unique person, and the Astor family had a very close relationship with Donald Trump. So Trump has the benefit of all of that connection. Here's another connection to Tesla that no one ever talks about, which is the Trump-Astor connection, the Astor-Tesla connection. Deep in that program are these interconnecting links. By the way, this is a shot of John Jacob Astor. Speaking of mystery schools, well, that's kind of a costume there, but you can see him getting dressed up for a mystery school, for sure. Absolutely fascinating. What else can I say about him? I think when he went down in the Titanic, it was very strange because a lot of people see the Titanic as an early financial coup d'etat so they could move in the Federal Reserve with ease just a year later. I think it's quite fascinating and it's worth exploring. Okay,
I just want to throw this in. Leilani G said that Revolver song on Beatles' Revolver, Dr. Robert, is about Robert Sarbacher.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
I don't know how
very
she
interesting.
knows that.
That's very interesting. I always thought it was about like a pill popper. But
yeah, exactly. Okay, anyway, Larvey Coswald says, DJ, how much of Tesla's hidden tech, such as thought projection, is being guided towards transhumanism? And Silver Fox says, is HARP a Tesla design?
Is that an anagram of Lee Harvey Oswald?
Of course.
Yeah, it is interesting. Are they using his technology for transhumanism? I think that they have a program for transhumanism, and that the more that they research things like Tesla, but remember, Tesla was smart to leave a lot of things out and not let them get at certain things. But I think the groups that even the military can't get at, what kind of a group is that? Obviously, it's some kind of national security division. And it's interesting, there's a whole story about how Garrison, at one point in 1968, is looking at his investigation, and he phones up the editor of Ramparts. And I've told the story before, but it's fascinating. He says, oh, we've been looking at this assassination all wrong. It's not so much the Texas oilmen. We need to look at the financing. And it seems to me that the actual assassination came out of the aerospace wing of the national security structure. So he was looking at aerospace. Well, who was in aerospace? You had the Howard Hughes group, you had Boeing, and you had Lockheed Martin. So somewhere in there is what Garrison was looking at. It seems to me those types of forces are the ones that we're up against. And when you see Lockheed Martin, taking over the next big project, and Boeing taking over the DARPA project for the X planes, they are our military contractors, but they seem to me out of control, the same way that the CIA has been out of control. So yeah, it's a very tricky situation.
CC Jarvis has some great questions tonight. Did Tesla leave any indication that he believed in reincarnation? Was he reincarnated? What was he in a past life? Any chance he was a Templar or Portuguese? And then also about Tesla's altered states. Was he channeling, a hybrid human? She wants your high octane speculation, please.
There's something very unusual about Tesla. I think when people come in out of time, that is, that they're so far ahead of time that we're just catching up to them. And I consider Rudolf Steiner to be one of these people. They come in with so much for humanity, and humanity doesn't always treat them so well. I mean, Tesla really got a really bad ride, and he's not celebrated the way that Edison and these other people are, although the word is getting out a little bit now. There's no doubt that he obtained his information through some kind of process. I think we can call it a psychic process. But there's an altered state that he goes into, and it's funny because they talked about his photographic memory, but he said that his mother had the real photographic memory, and that her family, which was from Western Serbia, were quite unusual. That it was their gene pool that he got all these fascinating abilities from. Maybe if we investigated his mother, who, by the way, didn't have any formal education at all, we'd learn a whole heck of a lot more. Okay, what else?
Seashells was wondering, is it true that Tesla received a lot of his info through dreams?
He did talk about dreams, and he did have that incredible vision where we get the alternating current. That was an altered state that he'd been in for 3 days, trying to imagine how the motor would work. It is funny, when they talk about Tesla and the lack of sleep, it always seems like they bring up 3 days, that he's going 3 days without sleep. I don't know where he got that or where he developed that pattern. But there are other unusual things about him, like he's born in a lightning storm, and then he has all this fascination for lightning. I don't know. I mean, that would be speculation largely, but there's something quite, it seems to me there's some mix of kind of clairvoyant ability with incredible intellectual ability. So it reminds me of somebody like Steiner.
Lunatux, DJ, was Tesla making use of ley lines?
He talked, when he goes to Colorado, there's no question about it. It's one of the most interesting things, that the areas that he selects, just like when he built Wardenclyffe, he's using that sense, much like Edward Leeds Scalman years later would build Coral Castle. And he wanted it to have a certain type of makeup. The environment had to be just so. It had to have this type of granite or these types of rocks or this much coral. So he very much, what happens is these guys, they kind of understand something. They understand some great secret about it. But if they share it with everyone, they know that it's going to be sort of in that corporate model. They're just going to homogenize it and abuse it. So we have to kind of look between the lines with their experiments. And when we go back and read Tesla's autobiography, I think there's a lot of clues in there.
Christine Taggart, did Casey and Tesla ever meet?
Casey, in fact, gave a reading for Nikola Tesla, and it's not one of those readings that we have a record of, unfortunately, but we can only imagine he gave readings for both Edison and Tesla. But of course, giving readings for important people, historical personages, is nothing new for Casey. Everyone from Woodrow Wilson to George Gershwin to Marilyn Monroe received readings from Edgar Casey. So there's an incredible background of that. But I am absolutely confident that with Casey's reading ability, he would have read Tesla right back into the Atlantean lifetime. And there's no doubt that Tesla is pure Atlantean in my book.
Mick Stanhope, was Tesla connected to the Orphic Circle?
Oh, it's a really interesting question. The Orphic Circle is something we brought up here relating to Emma Britton. Emma Britton's work is fascinating. What she did is she gave us a great treasure out of history that was hidden. But she was kept in a group, and she was raised for a purpose, kept aside from the other kids to be developed as a psychic, clairvoyant for a group in England. And the group, what they did is they used young clairvoyants to get state secrets, and they used them to solve riddles of the universe and things like that. And they would put them in a somnambulous state to obtain information. But they had a way of determining which people could do this. The idea of Tesla being associated with it, I don't know, he didn't belong to many groups. This is the fascinating thing about him. Plus, from what I've been able to ascertain, he didn't spend a whole heck of a lot of time in England, which is where all of their activities came from. But certainly in the episode that we did on Alice in Wonderland and the real Alice being Emma Britton in the Orphic Circle, that's an episode I'd recommend to follow up on that question.
Flippin' Tunes, have you seen the recent TV show about Tesla?
No, say Flippin' Tunes again.
It's Flippin' Tunes.
Oh, what is it?
Yeah, it's Flippin' Tunes with a CH.
Oh, Flippin' Tunes.
Okay. Have you seen the recent TV show about Tesla and his missing trunks, and what do you think happened to them?
Well, I went over some of that here. I always think TV shows do an incredibly flimsy job, I'm afraid. You know, they usually have these people driving around and it's like, we're going to dig in this spot and see if we can find it. And then most of it is about them arguing about whether to dig at night or during the day, or talking about, you know, nothing. And then the show's over, you know, you didn't learn anything. No, I think the Discovery Channel and the History Channel, like a lot of these, they use the stuff as a punchline. And I think they need to go deeper now and not have the kind of like soundbite shows. So I can't really think of a very good show relating to Tesla. There is a very interesting thing where Orson Welles played JP Morgan in a short that is on YouTube, and it's about Tesla and JP Morgan, and I think that they were getting into something there that is worthwhile. But certainly the idea of looking for the trunks is valid. I'd like to see a good show on that.
So has anyone decoded Tesla's protege's Otis T. Carr's dimensions of mystery papers?
Well, I'll tell you, I had a conversation, and it was quite interesting. It was Standeo, and he talked all about Otis Carr, and I think he's about the person who got the closest to that story. And we're going to have Stan on the show sometime later this summer, and we'll ask him that question for sure. It's a great question, and he's a good guy to bring up Otis Carr. Fascinating.
I'm just going to switch gears for a second. Daniel Natal says, it's weird. The more you learn about Nixon, the more he seems like a great president. I grew up on media propaganda thinking he was a crook.
Well, he was a victim of the deep state. He certainly knew that scene. He'd been vice president for 8 years under Eisenhower. He'd seen all the highs and lows of that. He'd been, you know, completely rolled over by JFK, who beat him in the election. He lost the governorship in 1962 to Pat Brown. I mean, really, you know, unbelievable things that he had been through to come back like he did in 1968. The only way he got in 1968 is because Bobby Kennedy was eliminated. And so very unbelievable karma around Nixon, who came from very humble roots. But I can say this about Nixon. It seems to me that he had a fundamental sense in the grand scheme of things that the culture needed to move forward. And energy was a big thing to him. And with him consulting people like Gene Dixon and just having this, you know, Norman Vincent Peale, like the connections that he had, I think that we need to take another look at Nixon and his presidency and his connections and his influence. And do we really have Trump now because of the influence that Nixon had on him? That is a great question. And it's starting to look more and more like it was Nixon who gave him the rules of the road. Now the question is, since Nixon knew so much about the UFO file, did he give Trump that info? Is that the kind of, Trump had what his uncle gave him about the UFO file from Vannevar Bush, but does Trump also have the Nixon information? It would seem to me maybe yes.
We have a great new chatter tonight. Donna Beveridge, who's very interesting.
Excellent.
Says, I still have a birth horoscope Gene Dixon did for me when I was born. I guess her mother was friends with her.
Yeah.
So many things have come true and are still guiding my life 50 years later. She was close to both Kennedy brothers and Reagan too.
Yes.
She also said, my dad worked at Skunk Works for 25 years and there's still stuff he won't tell me because he says it's not safe. He's freaked out that I'm getting into the X now.
Well, if he works at Skunk Works for 25 years, he knows all about the X Steganography because they use it in order to move those programs around. So just tell him, hey, welcome to the X family, Dad. It is fascinating, and I understand the security clearances and things that he's under in dealing with that. But I'll tell you that there are people who are no longer under security clearances who have dealt with the X Steganography, and I have spoken to them. So those people inside those programs, deep inside those programs, are so far ahead, and they know so much about the X things that we're talking about, that it must be kind of blowing their mind that we've sort of moved into this knowledge of the X Steganography. The thing is, we have the information the X is giving us, like the Rosetta Stone. It's giving us the key to following these different things, which, you know, I mean, it's become about that. This is the 18th episode of the series so far. We've done hours and hours and hours tracking the X stuff, and I still have more of it pouring in. So I mean, we're in a totally different trajectory. It completely transforms our understanding of three things fundamentally. One, the nature of the UFO file, absolutely. The nature of secret technology research, and the nature of the mystery school relationship to the political and societal processes. Those things are absolutely crucial. And now we understand that the presidents were all involved in leaving these X letters about their contribution to these things having to do with this X technology and the apotheum effect that follows on from it. We're really, I mean, we're kind of at the birth of a whole new paradigm in looking at these things. And I don't say it lightly. I mean, we're moving right into it, and we're moving fast. And it's going to take a lot for that whole community of people in alternative research and even in mainstream thinking to catch on to this, but they're going to, because the information is there. It's undeniable.
Stevie Mick says, when or what was the first use of the X shorthand that you know of?
The earliest?
Hmm.
Well, certainly the Egyptian mystery schools, we've shown the Book of the Dead. I wish I had that picture here, but if you look in the last episode, and we have the different deities and the different figures in the underworld wearing the X. So they brought it goes all the way back to the advanced Atlantean culture before Egypt. There's no question about it. And it goes very underground, but then we start to see it come up in all these different things. In Plato's Cross, we're going to do some work around that. And then, at St. Andrew's Cross, we have all these different things. Someone sent me actually as Bankster Slayer, and I'm going to show it maybe in the next episode, of the czars in Russia wearing these X's. And, it's an acknowledgement. Again, it's saying that we have that, we're moving, we're carrying on the tradition. So it is absolutely fascinating. But yeah, I would say it goes all the way back at least to the Book of the Dead.
Okay. Najat, does the ancient X steganography have the same meaning as the modern? Are the ancients saying aliens and their technology existed at that time, or are they serving a higher power?
You see, the ancient perspective is hard for us to keep our minds upon it. This is something that Edgar Cayce said in relation to our mindset at the time, that we weren't so closely knit in matter. That's hard for us to imagine. So the ancients, he said, were aware of activity going on 8 miles above them, as well as they would be in their day-to-day life. I can't even imagine that. So they're much more connected to nature and things like that. So when they would use imagery, it's on more than just an intellectual level. I think for us, the X thing triggers us subconsciously into information that's back there, that's kind of held in our subconscious over time. It's almost an ancestral memory, but it can be used practically by these groups who are moving the UFO file technology and this whole X technology through these different government agencies, and they're using it to track it. So they are using it in a different way, I would say, but it is pointing. I don't think that the ancients are pointing solely to an alien source. They're pointing to apotheum. It's an effect, a reality distortion effect that gets created out of the X, and it seems to represent humanity caught at a crux of different realities. I like to show the Rosicrucian. This man at the center of the X. This is crucial. It shows us that we've been working around this problem for a long time. Somehow, when the FBI is using X and the X files, when in popular culture we get things about X and Project X and stuff, there's some subconscious relevance to it that's coming up to the surface, bubbling up to the surface for us there. And so, yes, we find it as active in ancient times as it is in these secret groups now. And it always relates to secrecy. There's no question about it. It relates to secrecy in the UFO file. It relates to secrecy in the mystery schools and in the traditions that they carry on. And very often it's a signifier in the steganography saying, I know it, I'm with you. I'm with the X secrecy team, basically. I'm keeping on that secrecy team with you. Yeah, great question.
Okay.
Okay, we'll take just a couple more questions.
Bernadette Black mentioned something we were talking about recently. Daniel, I'm playing the X series over again from the beginning. I'm noticing a lot of Irish involvement in all of this.
Yes.
I'm telling all of my friends here in Ireland about the show.
Good. And I haven't even got into those Celtic kings. I haven't gotten into the whole Irish aspects. I've been looking at the Irish Atlantean mix, but there's always, when we get into this, there's always this Irish overhang when we're looking at different periods of time relating to the X. And when we're relating to the Atlantis information, when we're dealing with the Two-Eye Stone, Ireland comes up again and again. So that's absolutely fascinating, and thank you. What a great place to be, too. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Okay, so how does free energy relate to the Tesla energy?
The term free energy comes from the Tesla research. The idea was you can beam this energy freely across the globe the same way you'd beam a radio wave. So when we got all obsessed with beaming radio waves and sending signals back and forth and saying, wow, Marconi wasn't a phony, we could have made the jump there and said, let's do it with energy instead. He developed it. That's what Wycliffe was all about. That's why they demolished it and removed his memory. Is because if they had done that, the entire oil paradigm would have come down. The entire gas, fossil fuel paradigm would have been over. All of that stuff that they did, all of the wired stuff that they did and set up across the country and the world, would have been for naught, because he developed this whole new thing. And what they decided was, it's overstimulating. One, we don't have as much control this way. Let's just suppress him and suppress it. So that's the way that it went. And we've been living. Have you ever wondered, when you kind of looked at the cars that we have, for the, I took an Amtrak the other day, and it's terrible. I mean, the stuff is slow. It's not very advanced. And if anything, they just keep jamming it full of stuff. Who wants a TV in your car? How about if we got, instead, for it not to run on gasoline? Mm-hmm. That's the way we're going. So yeah, it's getting more and more complex, and not in the right way. I think we can go into a much more sophisticated. I mean, look at, even in Japan, they're developing all those maglev trains and the incredible speed trains, speed rail. And what do we have? The best we can do is a Acela. I think we'd probably do better than that. Okay.
Lunatux, DJ, why?
I like trains, by the way. I shouldn't make it sound like I don't like riding the train. I love it.
Why didn't the U.S. government make use of Tesla before his death in the early years of the war?
Well, it's a good point. He offered things to them. It's true. And I actually think that they were keeping so much surveillance on him that they did utilize things that they found operational from him. Time and time again, his papers were auctioned off, and they would say, like, oh, we're doing this because he didn't pay his bill at a hotel or something, and some newspaper would come in and swoop his papers and auction them off. Well, who lined up for the auction? Probably the military. So it is interesting. I do feel like they kept him at arm's length, and the most important thing was, we cannot let him get any credit, because if he gets credit, he'll be remembered in these history books, and that whole threat of the wireless technology will always be out there. We have to minimize his name, and they did it for a long time. But the problem was, too many scientists knew about who he was and his background. So, we got into this different thing. Okay, well, let's do just 2 more questions.
This is a very basic question, which I already answered in the chat. Lee Veltman, does DJ think COINTELPRO is used to discredit the ufology and paranormal community?
Well, Lee asked the good right down the middle question. Sometimes you need that right where it goes. Of course. Yes, absolutely. They do that. And it's interesting, because I think what we have is a fertile ground there in ufology for that type of targeting, because there's a lot of groups there and they don't have a unifying theme. And I think it's easy to splinter them off in different directions, or feed them fantasy stuff. We've seen a lot of fantasy stuff around the secret space program, and I've pointed that out on a number of occasions. Now we see them going into meltdown against each other, right? So it's pretty interesting, though, because the real root of the secret space program is a secret space network that contains a number of programs beneath it, and Blue Gemini being the heart of that. So the intelligence groups certainly would spill out kind of wild people with wild stories to keep the general, the relatable, the regular public off the trail so they wouldn't think about it, until those groups are good and ready with their kind of TTSA, CIA influenced phony version. And those groups just come out now, the To the Stars Academy, and they're like, hey, look, it's Lockheed Martin's guy, and here's the CIA's Luis Elizondo, and isn't he terrific? So now they're just being open about their CIA connections. I guess they feel they don't have to hide it anymore.
Cutting Through the Fog said Tesla said he was receiving signals from Mars. Did we already cover that one?
It is fascinating. I've covered it in a few shows. His actual comments are interesting. As he writes a letter to his scientific comrades, and he goes, "Brethren, I've gotten this message, and here's what it is." This is when he's in Colorado in that fascinating setup, trying to capture ball lightning. And he says, the message is 1, ... 2, ... 3, ... That's the message that he got. And it repeated itself, so he knew it was like a conscious message. So somebody was out there sending him that message, which he got in 1899. And then oddly enough, in a Pepsi commercial, they made like a 10-minute movie a couple of years ago where they used that. And I was absolutely dumbfounded, thinking, what on earth is Pepsi up to? And that was the same year that we saw those Super Bowl commercials about space elevators. And I was like, boy, these guys are really getting some kind of intel from somewhere. But yeah, absolutely fascinating. Okay, what else you got?
I really want to ask this question, although it's slightly off topic. Line of Judea says, does the new rise of fascism bother you? And DJ, that's me, before, and why is this happening?
I think the fascism has been ongoing since, and this is why Joseph Farrell's work is so valuable. And we've done a number of episodes pertaining to the post-war fascist influence. And his work is basically, that's the core of his work, actually. I think that stuff never really went away. I think it rebooted into South America predominantly, and it has come back through the European Union and through those influences. We've seen the influence here in our country through the Bushes and their connections, Prescott Bush and Union Bank, trading with the enemy and being involved with Fritz Tyson. So, no, I think those forces are there. They're absolutely real. And I see it's tricky, though, because when you say fascism, we have to get into what that is, too, because very often, a lot of people like to say, well, Trump immigration policy is fascism or something, but it's not. It's just having a border for your country. So we have to be able to spin what the corporate spin is, to see through what the corporate spin is around terms like fascism versus what actual fascism is. And, that whole thing around forced vaccines and things like that, that's a kind of fascism, you see. So we have to be able to separate out what we're talking about. Yeah, but yeah, any rise of fascism is a bad deal. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions because they're
James
so good.
Clements, does DJ think Trump will disclose at least some Tesla technology for a lasting and better life for all humanity?
Well, Trump is up to something with the Space Force, and I think that it's tricky because you have at the same time a lot of neocons on the military side trying to impress him in a certain way. I think Trump would love to be the person who brings out something new relating to energy advancement. And he seems to me somebody who really wants a legacy and wants to be first, which is important. That's why I think the Space Force is all about. But if the Space Force just gets used as a tool to militarize space, he'll go in exactly the opposite direction. So it's a tricky thing. I think with Trump, there are things to be hopeful about and things to be wary of. And the wary of mostly of the neocons that surround him, because I think he's gone in with some very good ideas, and we're certainly a lot better off than we would have been under a Clinton deep state presidency. But we'll see where it goes. A lot of it remains to be seen.
Let's end on a couple numbers quotes. So Psychohistory says Tesla was voted to be at the top of the IQ curve. The vote was unanimous, and his IQ was rated at 300.
Oh my God.
I know. And C Cup 1 says on the day of inauguration, Trump was 70 years old, 7 months, 7 days old, 777. Anything you want to say about that?
Well, we know the 777. It's fascinating, actually. I always think of the Edgar Cayce reading when he's looking at the past lives. Somebody brings up P.D. Ouspensky out of the blue, and the reading's over, and then Casey's sort of mumbling to himself, and he goes, oh, yeah, he was the keeper of the records in the mount of the people of the Mahaba in that period. 7th month, 7th day, 7 year, 777. And if you know the work of P.D. Ouspensky, which we're doing a show on shortly, then you know, absolutely, you know, fascinating, incredible character with incredible insights. But wow, that is wild. I do want to remind everybody to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. That's the way that we'll stay in touch. We have episode 19 coming up. I have an ex-witness coming on the show. This is somebody who's going to tell us about how the steganography is used in secrecy. We have some fantastic shows coming up. We have a great 3-part space episode that we did more interviews with Catherine Austin Fitz. That's going out. Some of that will be for the public. Some of that's going to subscribers. It's all coming out next week. Now's the time to get on board with the work that we're doing. And we have episode 19 and episode 20 coming up. Susan Manowich from New Energy Movement is coming up at the end of the month also. I'm very excited about that. Susan, of course, is a great guest on our show, and she's doing some fascinating work. And it's really exciting to have everyone here. I do feel like, you know, we're moving into that breakthrough period with the X Steganography, and it's all thanks to our interaction with you guys. You're giving us also the great back and forth that we're getting, because like I said, so much of this is kind of crowdsourced because I'm giving you that raw information and you are opening up. So it's like having hundreds of researchers out there pulling this stuff forward, and that's what we're going to need. Remember to get behind the Dark Journalist Show, subscribe. We've made it relatively easy. It's $49 a year. I think it's about $4 a month. And that gives you all the benefits. You're going to want to be a subscriber this summer because we're doing something very special that's coming up. And Olivia.
We want to thank Paul, you know who you are, for your generous support.
Yes.
And your support makes a huge difference. So really, thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. There was somebody else we were going to bring up now that you're
actually, Subtle Energy over 9000 says, can you ask DJ to remind everyone about gift cards for Staples and Starbucks? I thought that was a great idea. So I have to say, I went to Staples today and spent, you know, over $100 on ink and everything. So we always need Staples cards if you guys
the best
are
way
so inclined.
The best way to support the program is to subscribe. That I have to say across the board. Just subscribe to the program. If you go to darkjournalist.com/contribute.php, you can contribute to the show. Get behind it on a recurring basis. This is the kind of information that we want to bring to you guys. Absolutely. And, you know, it's the great thing really, because I don't like to make too much of an emphasis on it because we have so much information to give you, but that support is the same type of thing that we do because we reach out and we do that type of support. And I always say, let's get behind the things that are giving us the good information, giving us the life force, you know, and get away from the 2 minutes hate or the political circus or the corporate media. You know, we need to get to something that's real, and the X investigation is getting us somewhere real. Olivia, you've got the last word.
Well, I wanted to ask you, because it always comes up, is there any way for people to subscribe without getting involved in PayPal?
No, PayPal is the best way to do it, but if you go to the contribute link, contribute.php, or if you just go to darkjournalist.com and hit contribute, when you hit contribute, it gives you an option to use either PayPal or your credit card. So either of those would be really the way to go. But of course, both of those are easy, and you know, we try to make it incredibly affordable. That's the thing. And I think that's important too. So we've done it. And make sure you're signed up for the newsletter. Also, the newsletter is free, and it keeps us in charge and keeps us in touch with each other. We're going to have that kind of back and forth that you never know with social media. And I emphasize this a lot, but I want to make the point that it really is the kind of thing where they have the control of those platforms. So when we're online with each other, it's a totally different ballgame. We'll be back next week, and we look forward to seeing you all then. It's been a fantastic show. Remember, Tesla, Trump, and Vannevar Bush, all of that information comes out of the RADLAB. And now President Trump is the heir to that information. So we'll see what he does with it. And we know on the other side, the Democrats have their own idea about how to get that information out. And in the middle of it is the secret group that is using the X Steganography that it seems like nobody can get their hands on. Maybe now, since we're bringing the X public, that's going to change. Okay,
So
Olivia,
today, just in case you don't know, is National French Fry Day. And Sunday is National Ice Cream Day.
Well, what does it mean if it's an eclipse?
Mhm.
It's Friday the 13th.
Right.
Olivia's hungry, and it's National French Fry Day. What is the upshot?
You know what we're having for dinner.
What are we having for dinner?
We're having French fries.
French fry, of course.
With my spicy ketchup that I like.
There's nothing beats that.
Mhm.
What about Friday the 13th? It's kind of fascinating. Always, Friday the 13th, the myth comes from the Knights Templar, because that's when the Pope tried to get rid of them and had them executed. That's where they get that whole weird overhang of Friday the 13th. But of course, the Mayans also felt that the 13th was a very unusual number. So I think, if anything, we just go right into the mystic. And I guess with you, Olivia, we go into the mystic French fry.
Yeah.
But God, you did a great job with the questions
Thank you.
tonight. Fantastic. And wow, can you believe it, everyone? Olivia, just superstar. We'll be back next week, and it's great to have everyone here. I shout out to everyone. Like Erica McLaughlin's out there. I see them all. Ice Angel, and Daniel Natal, James Clements, Mythmaker. Fantastic to have everyone on board. We will see you next Friday.
Good night, everybody.
Is it really National French Fry Day?
Yes.
I thought you were putting
Ice cream day is more important, though. Sunday.
Watch out Sunday.
You can have a Sunday on Sunday.
Sunday.